As morning mist lifts from the village pond, we notice the water's surface covered with fallen leaves, brilliant reds from maples, golden yellows from birches, russet browns from oaks, creating a natural mosaic that shifts with every breeze. But this beautiful carpet of leaves is actually the beginning of a crucial ecological process that will sustain the pond's ecosystem throughout the coming year. When leaves fall into water, they don't simply sink and disappear, they become the foundation of an entire food web. The decomposition of autumn leaves in aquatic environments is a carefully orchestrated biological process involving thousands of organisms working in sequence. First, the leaves are colonized by bacteria and fungi that begin breaking down the leaf tissue, softening it and making it more palatable. These microorganisms are themselves consumed by tiny invertebrates, caddisfly larvae, mayfly nymphs, and freshwater shrimp that shred the softened leaves into smaller particles. These shredders are incredibly important. Studies have shown that streams and ponds where autumn leaf input is prevented show dramatic declines in invertebrate populations and, consequently, in the fish that feed on those invertebrates. The partially decomposed leaf fragments, now mixed with bacteria and fungal growth, are consumed by collector organisms that filter these particles from the water or gather them from the pond bottom. Meanwhile, the dissolved organic compounds leaching from the decomposing leaves feed algae and aquatic plants. This process is so important that scientists have calculated that in many temperate forest streams, more than 90% of the energy supporting the aquatic food web comes from terrestrial leaf litter rather than from photosynthesis by aquatic plants. The timing matters too. Leaves that fall in autumn decompose slowly in the cold water, providing a steady food source throughout winter when other nutrients are scarce. In spring, when water warms and decomposition accelerates, the remaining leaf material releases a pulse of nutrients that fuels algal blooms and supports emerging aquatic insects. This is why fall tree clearing along streams and ponds, while it might create a tidier appearance, can actually damage aquatic ecosystems by removing this crucial nutrient source. The leaves floating on the pond's surface will eventually sink, waterlogged and beginning their transformation from tree tissue to pond nutrient, supporting organisms you'll never see but which form the foundation of everything from the dragonflies that will emerge next summer to the fish rising to feed in the evening. Walking along the village stream, we notice someone repairing a dry stone wall that borders the pathway, carefully fitting rocks together without mortar, an ancient craft that creates structures lasting centuries. Dry stone wall construction is one of those skills that looks deceptively simple but requires years to master, combining engineering principles with an almost sculptural understanding of stone. The wall builder is selecting each stone carefully, examining its shape and size, testing how it fits with its neighbors, sometimes trying several stones before finding one that works. The fundamental principle is simple: gravity holds the wall together, but executing this principle requires sophisticated technique. A proper dry stone wall has a foundation of large, flat stones set slightly below ground level, providing a stable base. The wall then rises in courses, with each stone placed so that it bridges the joint between two stones in the course below. This is called breaking the joint, and it distributes weight and prevents vertical crack lines from forming. The wall has a slight backward lean, called batter, which makes it more stable. And crucially, the wall contains through stones, long stones that extend through the wall's entire width, tying the two faces together. Without these, the wall is essentially two separate stacks leaning against each other, prone to bulging and collapse. The spaces between stones aren't packed with small stones or rubble that would create pressure points and instability, but are left partially open, allowing the wall to flex slightly without crumbling and providing drainage so water doesn't build up behind the wall and push it over. A well-built dry stone wall can stand for hundreds of years, flexing with frost heave and settling without failing. In Britain and Ireland, Some dry stone walls are over 1,000 years old, still standing and still functional. The skill nearly died out in the mid-20th century as barbed wire fencing became cheap and easy, and fewer people were willing to invest the enormous labor required to build stone walls. But there's been a revival of interest, both for conservation of historic walls and for new construction in areas where the aesthetic and environmental benefits justify the cost. Dry stone walls provide habitat. The gaps between stones shelter countless organisms, including insects, spiders, small mammals, reptiles, and even nesting birds. The walls create microclimates, with the sunny side warming earlier in spring and staying warm later into autumn, while the shaded side remains cool and moist. Lichens and mosses colonize the stones, sometimes creating spectacular displays of color and texture. In regions with strong wall building traditions, the walls are landscape features as characteristic as the trees or hills, creating patterns of enclosure that define the countryside's character. The wall builder you're watching, carefully selecting and placing each stone, is practicing a craft that connects directly to the earliest days of agriculture, when humans first cleared land and needed to do something with the endless supply of stones that frost brought to the surface each year. Those stones became boundaries, became walls, became structures so well suited to their purpose and place that they've endured for millennia. The morning brings us to a field where turnips are being harvested, their purple-top white roots pulled from the earth and loaded into carts. Turnips seem like a humble crop, often dismissed or even mocked in modern cuisine, but they played a revolutionary role in agricultural history. Before the 18th century, European farmers faced a persistent problem. They had no good way to feed livestock through winter. Hay provided rough forage, but it wasn't nutritious enough to maintain animals in good condition, and there were no grain crops specifically for animal feed. Consequently, most livestock were slaughtered in autumn and the meat preserved, keeping only breeding stock alive through winter on minimal rations. This created chronic meat shortages and meant that draft animals, oxen and horses needed for spring plowing, were often in poor condition after winter, lacking the strength for heavy work. The solution emerged gradually through the 17th and 18th centuries as part of what historians call the British Agricultural Revolution, and root crops, particularly turnips, were central to it. Turnips could be grown in fields that would otherwise lie fallow. They could be stored for months in root cellars or even left in the ground and harvested as needed through winter, and they provided nutritious feed that kept animals healthy and productive. But turnips did more than just feed animals. They enabled a fundamental change in farming systems. The traditional practice had been to leave fields fallow every third year to restore soil fertility, meaning 1/3 of farmland was unproductive each year. The Norfolk four-course rotation, developed in the early 1700s, replaced the fallow year with turnips and clover. The sequence went wheat, turnips, barley, clover, then back to wheat. The turnips and clover were fed to livestock, whose manure fertilized the soil, eliminating the need for fallow while actually increasing productivity. This system spread across Europe and later to North America, fundamentally increasing agricultural output. More livestock could be kept through winter, producing more meat, milk, and draft power, while also producing more manure to fertilize grain crops. The increased food supply supported population growth and urbanization. The Industrial Revolution wouldn't have been possible without the agricultural revolution that preceded and enabled it, and turnips were a key component. There's also an interesting botanical aspect to turnips. They're brassicas, related to cabbage, kale, broccoli, and mustard. All these diverse vegetables are actually the same species, Brassica oleracea, that has been bred into wildly different forms through thousands of years of selective breeding. Turnips belong to a closely related species, Brassica rapa, which also includes bok choy and Chinese cabbage. The fact that humans have transformed wild plants into such diverse and useful forms is a testament to agricultural ingenuity. The turnips being harvested and loaded into carts represent far more than a simple root vegetable. They represent an agricultural innovation that helped feed the modern world. As we continue along the lane, we pass a hedgerow where rosehips glow brilliant red among the thorny branches, and a villager is carefully harvesting them, dropping the small fruits into a basket. Rosehips, the fruit of wild roses that forms after the flowers fade, are a traditional autumn harvest with remarkable nutritional properties that made them crucial during times of scarcity. Modern research has validated some of these traditional uses. Rosehips contain not just vitamin C but also flavonoids, carotenoids, and other compounds with anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. The challenge with rosehips is that the fruits are small and tedious to process. Each hip contains numerous seeds surrounded by fine hairs that can irritate the mouth and throat. Traditional preparation involves cutting the hips open, scooping out the hairy seeds, then cooking the remaining flesh into syrup, jelly, or tea. Some recipes call for drying the hips and grinding them into powder, seeds and all, accepting the irritating hairs as the price of nutrition. The hairs, incidentally, were the origin of itching powder. Pranks. Dried and crushed rosehip seeds make an effective if mean-spirited irritant. The person harvesting rosehips you're watching knows this harvest will yield relatively little given the effort required, perhaps a few jars of jelly or a bottle of syrup, but the practice connects to generations of foragers who understood that the landscape provides gifts beyond cultivated crops, if you know what to look for and when to harvest it. The afternoon finds us at the village cooperage, where barrel making continues, a specialized craft essential for storage and transport of everything from wine and beer to salted meat and flour. The cooper is shaping staves, the individual curved planks that will form the barrel's body, using a draw knife to taper and smooth each piece. Cooperage is one of the most demanding traditional crafts, requiring precise work with difficult materials and involving techniques that seem almost magical until you understand the underlying principles. A barrel is a remarkably sophisticated container. It's watertight without glue or sealant. It's enormously strong despite being made of thin wood. It can be rolled easily despite being very heavy when full. And it can be disassembled, transported flat, and reassembled. The key to a barrel's watertightness is precision. The staves must be shaped so they fit together perfectly with no gaps, and they're held in place by hoops that compress them tightly together. Getting this precision requires incredible skill. Each stave is cut from a section of log split along the grain. Sawn lumber doesn't work because sawing cuts across some grain fibers, creating weakness and leakage pads. The staves are shaped so they're wider at the ends than in the middle, creating the barrel's distinctive bulge. Then comes one of coopering's most impressive techniques. The staves are arranged in a temporary circle inside one end hoop, and fire is built inside this partial barrel. As the wood heats, it becomes pliable, and the cooper tightens hoops around the staves, gradually bending them into the barrel's curved shape. The smell of toasting wood fills the workshop, and the staves, which started as straight planks, curve smoothly to form the barrel's body. Once cooled, the wood holds this shape permanently. The barrel heads, the circular ends are fitted into grooves cut inside the assembled staves, and final hoops are driven into place. A properly made barrel will hold liquid without leaking a drop, even under considerable pressure. Different contents require different woods and construction techniques. Oak is prized for wine and spirits because it's tight-grained and waterproof, and it contributes flavor compounds that improve the beverage. Whiskey barrels are charred on the inside before use, and this charcoal layer filters the aging spirit and adds color and flavor. Wine barrels are less heavily toasted but still heat-treated, And winemakers distinguish between American oak and French oak barrels based on the subtle flavor differences they impart. Barrels for dry goods like flour or gunpowder can be made from cheaper woods like pine and don't require the same precision. The cooper's craft was so essential that coopers were found in every town and city, and maritime powers like Britain maintained large cooperages to supply barrels for ships' water, beer, salted meat, ship's biscuit, and gunpowder all traveled in barrels. The profession declined with the development of metal containers, plastic drums, and cardboard boxes, but it never disappeared entirely. Wine and spirits industries still require wooden barrels, and there's been renewed interest in barrel-aged everything from beer to hot sauce. The cooper you're watching, shaping staves with tools that would be recognizable to a medieval craftsman, is maintaining a tradition stretching back thousands of years. Archaeologists have found barrel remnants in Celtic sites from before the Roman era, making cooperage one of humanity's oldest specialized trades. As the sun begins its descent, we come upon a fascinating sight. A farmer spreading lime on a field, the white powder creating dramatic patterns as it's broadcast across the dark soil. Liming fields applying crushed limestone or slaked lime to agricultural land is a practice with roots in ancient agriculture but with modern relevance that's increasingly recognized. The purpose is to neutralize soil acidity, raising the pH to levels where crops grow best. Most agricultural plants prefer slightly acidic to neutral soil, with pH between 6.0 and 7.0, but many soils, particularly in regions with high rainfall, naturally become more acidic over time. Rainwater is slightly acidic, and as it percolates through soil, it gradually leaches away calcium and other alkaline minerals, leaving the soil more acidic. Acidic soils have several problems for agriculture. Essential nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium become less available to plants even when physically present in the soil. Toxic elements like aluminum and manganese become more soluble and can reach levels that poison plants, and beneficial soil bacteria that fix nitrogen or decompose organic matter work less efficiently. The application of lime counteracts these problems by neutralizing acid and replenishing calcium. The ancient Romans wrote about liming fields, and the practice was common in medieval European agriculture. But there's an interesting historical note. The lime used in agriculture isn't the same as the citrus fruit. Agricultural lime is calcium carbonate, crushed limestone, which reacts with soil acids to raise pH. The amount needed varies with soil type and existing acidity. Clay soils typically require more lime than sandy soils to achieve the same pH change because clay's chemical properties buffer against pH change. There's an art to liming. Too much can make the soil too alkaline, which creates its own set of nutrient availability problems. And lime moves very slowly through soil, so it needs to be incorporated through plowing rather than just spread on the surface. The effects of liming aren't immediate. It can take weeks or months for lime to fully react with soil acids and change the pH, which is why autumn liming is ideal. Applied now, the lime has all winter to react, and by spring planting, the soil pH will have stabilized at the improved level. There's also an environmental dimension to liming that's gained attention recently. Healthy, properly pH-balanced soils support more robust microbial communities, which sequester more carbon and produce less nitrous oxide, a potent greenhouse gas, than stressed soils. Some research suggests that agricultural liming could play a role in climate change mitigation by improving soil health and carbon storage. The farmer spreading lime across the field is engaging in soil chemistry. Whether he thinks of it that way or not, adjusting the acidity of his land to create optimal conditions for next year's crops, continuing a practice that has sustained agriculture for thousands of years while participating in cutting-edge discussions about sustainable farming and environmental stewardship. As twilight deepens, we arrive at a small plot where medicinal herbs are being harvested before frost damages them. The herbalist is carefully cutting and bundling plants feverfew, Steady John's wort, valerian, and others, each with traditional uses in healing. Herbal medicine has been practiced for as long as humans have existed, and autumn was traditionally the crucial harvest time for many medicinal plants when active compounds reach their peak concentration. The relationship between plants and medicine is profound and often underappreciated in modern times when most people's experience with medicine involves synthetic pharmaceuticals. But the majority of modern medicines were originally derived from plants or were inspired by plant compounds. Aspirin was developed from salicylic acid found in willow bark, which had been used for pain relief for thousands of years. Digitalis, a crucial heart medication, comes from foxglove. Morphine and codeine come from opium poppies. Quinine, which allowed Europeans to survive in malaria-prone tropical regions, comes from cinchona bark. The list is extensive. Plants produce these compounds not for human benefit but as chemical defenses against herbivores, pathogens, and competing plants. It's a remarkable coincidence, or perhaps not coincidence, but the result of shared evolutionary history, that many compounds plants produce for their own purposes happen to have useful effects on human physiology. The challenge with herbal medicine has always been dosage and standardization. A tea made from willow bark contains salicylic acid, but the amount varies depending on the tree's species, age, and growing conditions, the bark's age, how the tea is prepared, and numerous other factors. One cup might be ineffective, another might be toxic. Modern pharmaceuticals solve this by extracting and purifying active compounds and standardizing doses, ensuring consistency and safety. But this process also removes traditional herbalism's holistic context. Traditional herbalists argue that plants contain not just single active compounds but suites of related chemicals that work together synergistically, and that isolating single compounds loses this beneficial complexity. There's ongoing scientific debate about this. Some studies suggest synergistic effects. Others find that purified compounds work as well or better than whole plant preparations. What's certain is that plants remain an enormous reservoir of potential medicines. Ethnobotanists work with indigenous peoples worldwide to document traditional medicinal plant use before this knowledge is lost, and pharmaceutical companies screen thousands of plant compounds looking for new drugs. The herbalist you're watching, carefully harvesting and bundling plants, is maintaining knowledge that stretches back to the earliest humans who learned through trial and error which plants could heal and which could harm. The bundles will be hung to dry in a well-ventilated space, then stored for use throughout winter. Teas for colds, tinctures for anxiety, salves for skin conditions, poultices for bruises and sprains. Whether you view this as valuable traditional medicine or as folklore superseded by modern pharmaceuticals, it represents a living connection to humanity's longest continuous healing tradition. As full darkness settles, we make our way to the village commons where preparations are underway for a bonfire celebration. The pile of wood and brush has been carefully constructed, with kindling at the base and larger logs arranged above to ensure a good draft. Autumn bonfires are traditional across many cultures, often marking the harvest's end and the transition toward winter. The word bonfire itself has interesting etymology. It likely derives from bone fire, referring to medieval practices where animal bones from slaughtered livestock were burned in large outdoor fires. These fires served multiple purposes. They disposed of waste that might otherwise attract scavengers and spread disease. They provided light and warmth for community gatherings, and they held ritual significance in marking seasonal transitions. In Celtic tradition, Samhain, pronounced Samhain, fires marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, the darker half of the year. These weren't merely celebrations but were believed to have protective and purifying qualities. Livestock were driven between two fires to cleanse them before winter housing, and people would extinguish their hearth fires and relight them from the communal bonfire, symbolically uniting the community. The British bonfire tradition on Guy Fawkes Night, November 5th, commemorates a failed plot to blow up Parliament in 1605, but it likely incorporated much older autumn fire traditions. The science of a good bonfire is more complex than it appears. Wood doesn't burn directly, rather. Heat drives off volatile compounds from the wood. This is why you can see flames rising from wood even where the flames aren't touching the wood itself, and these gases burn when they mix with oxygen in the presence of heat. For efficient burning, you need the fire triangle: fuel, oxygen, and heat. The structure of the bonfire pile matters enormously. Too compact and air can't circulate, starving the fire of oxygen. Too loose and heat dissipates without igniting larger pieces. The traditional cone shape with a hollow center creates a chimney effect. Heat rises through the center, drawing fresh air in from the bottom, creating a powerful draft that feeds the fire and pulls flames upward. Different woods burn differently. Resinous softwoods like pine ignite easily and burn hot but fast, creating spectacular flames but little lasting coals. Hardwoods like oak or hickory ignite more slowly but burn longer and create substantial coals. A well-planned bonfire uses softwood for initial ignition and to create the heat needed to ignite hardwood, which then provides sustained burning. Safety considerations are substantial. Flying sparks can travel surprising distances and ignite roofs or dry vegetation, which is why bonfires are traditionally lit in cleared areas away from structures. The heat is intense. You can't stand within 10 or 15 feet of a large bonfire, and the thermal radiation can be felt from 50 feet away. This radiant heat was put to practical use in traditional agriculture. The ash from bonfires, rich in potassium and other minerals, was collected and spread on fields as fertilizer. Some farmers would deliberately burn brush and waste wood on fields that would be planted to potatoes or other crops the following year, directly fertilizing the soil where it would be used. The bonfire being prepared represents continuity with practices stretching back to humanity's first mastery of fire, serving as community gathering point, practical waste disposal, and symbolic marker of seasonal transition, all roles that fire has played in human society for hundreds of thousands of years. The bonfire begins to blaze, casting dancing shadows and filling the air with the scent of burning wood. We settle on two benches arranged in a circle around the fire. An elder begins telling stories, tales of harvests past, of unusual weather years, of characters and events from the village's history. This oral tradition of storytelling around autumn fires served crucial functions in pre-literate societies, preserving community memory and transmitting knowledge across generations. Before writing was widespread, everything a community knew about its history, about agricultural techniques, about local ecology and weather patterns, about social relationships and moral values, had to be maintained in human memory and passed down through stories. Autumn, with its completion of harvest and the longer evenings before winters and forced idleness, was an ideal time for this transmission. The stories you're hearing aren't random entertainment, they're cultural memory in action. The tale of the Great Frost of 1740 that killed fruit trees and caused famine isn't just history, it's a warning about vulnerability and a reminder to maintain diverse food sources. The story of how the village well was dug and why it sits in its particular location encodes crucial information about hydrogeology and water sources. The humorous tale of a villager who tried to rush harvest and lost much of his crop to rain teaches the virtue of patience and attention to weather signs. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have found that stories serve as mnemonic devices. Humans remember narratives far better than abstract facts, so encoding important information in story form ensures its preservation. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia maintain knowledge of coastal geography, including the locations of now submerged islands and shorelines from the end of the last ice age over 10,000 years ago. through stories passed down through hundreds of generations. These weren't mythical tales but accurate geographic information preserved in narrative form. European folk tales often contain fragments of very ancient knowledge, fairy tales about mills, wells, forests, and agriculture that encode information about traditional practices and resources. The stories being told around this fire serve all these functions simultaneously. They entertain, they educate, they preserve memory. They strengthen community bonds by creating shared knowledge and experience, and they mark this particular night as special, distinguishing it from ordinary time. The fire itself enhances the storytelling. There's neurological research suggesting that staring into flames induces a slightly altered state of consciousness, a relaxed attentiveness that may make people more receptive to stories and more likely to remember them. The combination of fire, darkness, community gathering, and storytelling is among humanity's oldest cultural practices, predating agriculture, predating pottery, possibly predating language itself in some proto-form. Sitting around this bonfire, listening to stories while flames dance and sparks rise into the night sky, you're participating in something fundamentally human, a practice that connects you not just to this village's past but to the deep history of the human species. As the fire burns down to glowing coals and people begin to drift away toward their homes, we take a final walk through the now quiet village streets. The moon has risen, and frost is already forming on rooftops and fence posts, the temperature dropping rapidly in the clear autumn night. We notice smoke rising from chimneys as families bang their fires for the night, ensuring coals remain alive until morning rather than allowing fires to go out and needing to relight them. This practice of fire maintenance was essential before matches were common. Keeping coals alive through the night meant fire could be quickly revived in the morning, while an extinguished hearth meant the difficult work of striking sparks from flint and steel, nursing those sparks into tinder, and gradually building a fire from nothing. The technology of fire keeping is ancient and surprisingly sophisticated. In some cultures, people buried live coals in ash before bed. Ash is an excellent insulator, and coals buried in sufficient ash would smolder slowly all night, ready to be exposed and fed with kindling in the morning. Other cultures use specific woods known to hold coals well. Oak is excellent for this, producing dense coals that burn slowly and hold heat for hours. There were specialized tools, fire covers made of metal that could be placed over banked coals to restrict airflow and slow burning, and ember carriers, ventilated pots that allowed live coals to be transported from one house to another, so a neighbor whose fire had gone out could borrow coals rather than starting from scratch. The importance of maintaining fire is difficult for modern people to appreciate. We flick switches or turn knobs and have instant light, heat, or cooking capability. But for most of human history, fire was precious and required constant attention. Letting your fire go out meant cold, darkness, and inability to cook food. In cold weather, it could be life-threatening. This is why ancient hearth goddesses like Hestia, Greek, and Vesta, Roman, were so important. The hearth fire was literally the center of household life, and its maintenance was both practical necessity and sacred duty. The Vestal virgins in Rome tended the city's sacred fire, and its extinction was considered a diromen. The smoke rising from village chimneys represents continuity with this ancient relationship with fire, even though the fires are now easily relatable and no longer represent the difference between survival and catastrophe. The careful banking of fires for the night, adding enough fuel to keep coals alive but not so much that the fire burns wastefully through the night, is a skill passed down through generations. A small but meaningful piece of traditional knowledge about living with fire. And so our sixth journey through this timeless autumn village draws to a close. The fires banked for the night, the community preparing for sleep after another day of harvest work completed, the frost settling over fields and gardens, and the eternal rhythms of agricultural life continuing work and rest, gathering and storing, community and solitude, summer's abundance transitioning into winter's austerity, all proceeding as they have for countless generations, as they will for generations yet to come. As morning light breaks across the village, we find ourselves walking through an orchard where the ground is covered with windfall apples, fruit that has dropped naturally from the trees, bruised and beginning to ferment in the cool autumn air. The sweet, slightly alcoholic smell is intoxicating, and if we're quiet, we might see wildlife taking advantage of this abundance. Deer browse on the fallen fruit, birds peck at the soft flesh, and insects swarm over the fermenting sugars, but there's a fascinating biological phenomenon occurring here that few people realize. These animals are experiencing mild intoxication from the alcohol produced by natural fermentation. Wild yeasts on the apple skins begin fermenting the fruit's sugars as soon as the skin is broken, and within days, windfall apples can contain measurable amounts of alcohol. There are documented cases of birds becoming so intoxicated from fermenting fruit that they fly erratically or can't fly at all, and there are historical accounts of bears, moose, and other large mammals exhibiting drunk behavior after consuming large quantities of fermented apples or other fruit. The windfall apples rotting in the orchard represent not just wasted fruit but a window into natural processes that have shaped animal behavior and possibly even human evolution over millions of years. Continuing through the village, we come upon a remarkable sight. Thousands of ladybugs clustered on the sunny side of a barn, so densely packed that the wall appears to be moving. This is aggregation behavior, and it's one of the most striking phenomena of autumn insect life. Ladybugs, more properly called lady beetles or ladybird beetles, are preparing for winter, and they do so communally, gathering in enormous groups that can number in the tens of thousands. The clustering typically occurs on the sides of buildings, trees, or rock outcroppings that face south or southwest, where maximum sun exposure during autumn days helps keep the aggregation warm. The beetles are responding to chemical signals called aggregation pheromones. When one beetle finds a suitable overwintering site, it releases these chemical attractants, and other beetles follow the signal, creating a positive feedback loop where more beetles attract even more beetles. The clustering serves multiple purposes. First, it provides thermal benefits. A mass of thousands of beetles retains heat better than individual beetles could, and on warm autumn days, the cluster can generate significant warmth through the beetles' collective metabolism. Second, it may provide protection through sheer numbers. Predators that might eat a few beetles are overwhelmed by thousands and can't make a significant dent in the population. Third, it ensures that when spring arrives and the beetles emerge, there are many individuals in close proximity, making it easier to find mates. However, this aggregation behavior has created a modern problem. Ladybugs, particularly the multicolored Asian lady beetle introduced to North America as a biological control for aphids, often choose buildings as their overwintering sites. They can find their way inside through tiny cracks and gaps, and homeowners sometimes find thousands of beetles inside walls, attics, or living spaces. The beetles are harmless. They don't bite, though they can pinch slightly, don't damage structures, and don't reproduce indoors, but their sheer numbers and their tendency to release a yellowish, foul-smelling defensive fluid when disturbed make them unwelcome house guests. From an ecological perspective, ladybugs are tremendously beneficial. Both adult beetles and their alligator-like larvae are voracious predators of aphids, scale insects, and other plant pests, A single ladybug can consume 50 aphids per day, and over its lifetime, might eat 5,000 or more. Traditional farmers recognized this and welcomed ladybugs. There are historical accounts of farmers purchasing ladybugs by the gallon and releasing them in orchards and fields. This practice continues today. You can buy bags of live ladybugs for garden pest control. Though there's debate about effectiveness since the released beetles often disperse rather than staying where they're released, the mass of ladybugs on the barn wall represents a survival strategy refined over millions of years. A communal approach to winter that allows these beneficial insects to survive months of cold when their aphid prey is unavailable, ready to emerge in spring and begin another season of pest control. The morning walk takes us past a field being prepared for winter wheat planting, and we notice the farmer has added something unusual to his seed, a dark powder coating each grain. This is seed treatment, a modern agricultural practice with ancient roots. The coating contains fungicides and sometimes insecticides that protect the germinating seed from soil-borne diseases and pests during the vulnerable period between planting and emergence. The concept of treating seeds before planting is surprisingly old. Roman agricultural writers described soaking seeds in various concoctions before sowing, and medieval farmers used techniques like mixing seeds with ash or dung. But modern seed treatment began in the early 20th century when it was discovered that certain mercury compounds could prevent seed-borne fungal diseases, particularly the smut fungi that turn grain kernels into masses of black spores. Mercury seed treatment was widely used from the 1920s through the 1960s and was remarkably effective at controlling disease. However, it created serious environmental and health problems. Mercury is highly toxic and persistent, and mercury-treated seeds poisoned wildlife that ate them and contaminated soil and water. There were tragic incidents of human poisoning, particularly in Iraq in 1971–72, when mercury-treated seed grain intended for planting was instead ground into flour and baked into bread, resulting in thousands of deaths and permanent neurological damage to many more. This catastrophe led to the global phase-out of mercury seed treatments and their replacement with less toxic fungicides. Modern seed treatments use various active ingredients, typically neonicotinoid insecticides and triazole fungicides, which are far safer than mercury but have their own controversies. Neonicotinoids have been implicated in bee population declines, leading to bans or restrictions in many regions. The debate over seed treatments illustrates a fundamental tension in agriculture: the need to protect crops from pests and diseases versus concerns about environmental impacts and unintended consequences. Seed treatment is highly efficient in one sense: it delivers pesticides exactly where and when they're needed, in minimal quantities, rather than broadcast spraying entire fields. But the chemicals don't stay exclusively on the target crop. They can move into surrounding soil and water, be taken up by neighboring plants, and affect non-target organisms. The farmer planting his treated seed is making a calculated decision based on disease pressure in his fields, the value of his crop, and his assessment of risks, a microcosm of the larger questions facing modern agriculture about how to feed growing human populations while minimizing environmental harm. As midday approaches, we find ourselves at the village pottery, where the potter is finishing a batch of storage crocks for the autumn harvest. The kiln is cooling after firing, and soon the finished pieces will be removed and put to use storing pickles, sauerkraut, and other preserved foods. Pottery has been essential to food preservation for thousands of years, and the specific properties of ceramic vessels make them ideal for fermentation and storage. Clay, when fired at high temperatures, transforms chemically. The heat drives off water molecules bound in the clay's crystalline structure and causes the clay particles to fuse together in a process called vitrification. The result is a material that's hard, durable, and crucially, impermeable to liquids while still allowing tiny amounts of gas exchange. This gas exchange is important for fermentation. The lactic acid bacteria that ferment vegetables into pickles and sauerkraut produce carbon dioxide that needs to escape, but you don't want air which contains oxygen and potentially spoilage organisms to enter the vessel. Traditional fermentation crocks solve this through elegant design. A water seal rim where the lid sits in a channel filled with water, creating an airlock that allows gas to bubble out while preventing air from entering. The development of pottery revolutionized food storage and preparation. Before pottery, humans had limited options. Food could be stored in baskets, which were porous leather bags which were difficult to clean and could impart flavors, or hollowed-out gourds which were fragile. Pottery provided containers that could hold liquids, could be cleaned thoroughly, could be heated directly over fire for cooking, and could be made in any size or shape needed. Archaeological evidence shows pottery appearing independently in different cultures around the world between 10,000 and 20,000 years ago, generally coinciding with the transition from nomadic hunting-gathering to settled agricultural life. This isn't coincidental. Pottery is heavy and fragile, impractical for nomadic peoples who must carry all their possessions, but enormously useful for settled agriculturalists who need to store grain, cook meals, and preserve harvests. The specific techniques of pottery making vary by culture and available materials, but the fundamental process is universal. Clay is shaped while wet, allowed to dry, then fired at high temperature to permanently harden it. Different clays and firing temperatures produce different results. Earthenware fired at lower temperatures around 1800 F is porous and requires glazing to be watertight, while stoneware fired at higher temperatures around 2200 F vitrifies enough to be naturally waterproof. The glazes applied to pottery serve both functional and decorative purposes. They seal porous clay bodies, provide smooth surfaces that are easy to clean, and can add color and decoration. Some traditional glazes contained lead, which created beautiful, glossy surfaces but posed serious health risks as lead could leach into acidic foods. This was a particular problem with cider and wine stored in lead-glazed vessels. The acid dissolved lead from the glaze, and chronic consumption caused lead poisoning. The elimination of lead from pottery glazes was a significant public health achievement of the 20th century. The storage crocks emerging from the kiln represent a technology that has sustained human civilization for millennia. Containers that will hold this year's harvest in fermented form, preserving the abundance of autumn for consumption through winter and spring. The afternoon brings us to a small apiary where the beekeeper is performing an unusual task, wrapping hives in black tar paper for winter insulation. This practice of winterizing beehives reveals the delicate balance bees must maintain to survive cold weather and the various strategies beekeepers use to help them. Wild honeybees typically nest in hollow trees, where the thick wooden walls provide excellent insulation, and they select cavities of specific sizes, usually about 40 liters in volume, that balance the need for food storage space against the need to keep the interior warm with the colony's body heat. Domestic hives are typically less well insulated than hollow trees, and they're often larger than wild bees would choose, making winter survival more challenging. The black tar paper serves multiple purposes. It provides an additional layer of insulation, and its dark color absorbs solar radiation on sunny winter days, helping to warm the hive. But beekeepers must be careful not to over-insulate. Bees need some ventilation even in winter, because the winter cluster produces both heat and moisture as the bees metabolize honey. If moisture can't escape, it condenses on the inside of the hive and can drip onto the cluster, chilling and potentially killing bees. Traditional beekeeping wisdom includes many winterization practices that modern research has validated or refuted. One controversial practice is feeding sugar syrup in autumn to ensure adequate stores. Wild bees survive exclusively on honey they've produced, But domestic colonies that have had honey harvested by beekeepers may not have sufficient stores for winter. A colony needs roughly 60 pounds of honey to survive a typical winter, more in colder climates or longer winters. Beekeepers often leave the later flows of honey for the bees rather than harvesting it, and supplement with sugar syrup if stores seem insufficient. Critics argue this produces weaker bees dependent on artificial feeding. Proponents argue it's necessary compensation for honey that was harvested. There's fascinating thermoregulation involved in winter survival. The bees don't heat the entire hive, that would be impossibly energy intensive. Instead, they form a tight cluster that might be the size of a basketball in the coldest weather, and they heat only this cluster, maintaining the core temperature around 93 F even when outside temperatures drop far below freezing. The bees on the outer surface of the cluster act as insulation, keeping their body temperatures just above freezing, while those in the core stay warm. The cluster slowly moves through the hive over the winter, consuming stored honey as they go. If temperatures rise on a warm winter day, the cluster loosens and bees may even fly out to defecate. Bees hold waste all winter and must eliminate it periodically to avoid dysentery. If a colony survives winter but the queen dies or fails, the colony is doomed despite having workers still alive, because only the queen can lay the eggs needed to replenish the population in spring. The beekeeper wrapping hives is performing an act of stewardship, trying to tip the odds in favor of survival, knowing that even with the best care, some colonies won't make it through to spring. Beekeeping combines agricultural practice, biological understanding, and a touch of gambling against the weather, a fitting occupation for autumn as the season turns toward winter. As we walk on, we pass a field where flocks of birds are feeding intensely on weed seeds and spilled grain, and we notice they're noticeably plumper than they were just weeks ago. These are birds preparing for migration, undergoing a physiological transformation called hyperphagia, an intense feeding period where birds consume food far beyond normal levels, building fat reserves for their journey south. Migration is one of nature's most impressive phenomena, and the preparation for it reveals sophisticated biological programming. Small songbirds that might weigh 20 grams normally can nearly double their weight in the weeks before migration, packing on fat that will fuel their journey. This isn't simply eating more, it's a complete metabolic shift triggered by changing day length, which the birds detect through photoreceptors in their brains. As autumn days shorten, these receptors trigger hormonal changes that increase appetite, alter metabolism to favor fat storage, and eventually trigger the migratory restlessness called Zugenruhe, a German word describing the agitation birds show when they're ready to migrate. The efficiency of bird metabolism is extraordinary. Fat provides about 9 calories per gram, more than twice what carbohydrates or proteins provide, making it the ideal fuel for long-distance travel. A small warbler with 5 grams of stored fat can fly non-stop for 50 or more hours, covering hundreds of miles without food or rest. Some species make even more impressive journeys. The blackpoll warbler, a tiny songbird weighing less than an ounce, makes a non-stop flight from the northeastern United States to South America, flying 1,800 miles over open ocean in roughly 72 to 88 hours. To accomplish this, the birds essentially turn themselves into flying fuel tanks, with fat comprising 40 to 50% of their pre-flight body weight. Birds also undergo changes in organ size. Their digestive organs, which are heavy and not needed during flight, actually shrink, while their flight muscles and heart enlarge. These changes reverse after migration. When the bird reaches its destination, the navigation abilities required for migration are still not fully understood despite decades of research. Birds use multiple navigation cues. They can sense Earth's magnetic field using magnetoresistors in their eyes and beaks. They navigate by the sun and stars, requiring the ability to compensate for the changing positions of celestial bodies throughout the day and year. They use visual landmarks for familiar territories, and they may even use olfactory cues, Young birds making their first migration often travel separately from adults, yet somehow navigate thousands of miles to wintering grounds they've never seen, suggesting at least some navigational ability is innate rather than learned. The risks of migration are substantial. Birds face predators, storms, exhaustion, and disorientation. Many die en route, particularly during their first migration, yet the benefits must outweigh the risks, or this behavior wouldn't have evolved and persisted. Migrating allows birds to exploit seasonal food abundance, insects and seeds that are available in northern latitudes during summer but vanish in winter, while avoiding the cold and food scarcity of northern winters. The plump birds feeding in the field are preparing for a journey that will test them to their biological limits, following innate programming refined over millions of years, participating in one of nature's great annual spectacles. The afternoon shadows lengthen as we approach the village tannery, where hides from autumn slaughtered animals are being processed. The smell is powerful, a mixture of organic decay, chemicals, and wood smoke that's distinctive and, to modern sensibilities, unpleasant. But tanning is an essential craft that transforms putrescible animal skins into stable leather that won't rot, and the process reveals sophisticated chemistry discovered through thousands of years of experimentation. An untreated animal hide will decompose rapidly because it's mostly protein collagen fibers, which bacteria readily consume. Tanning works by chemically modifying these proteins, linking the collagen fibers together in ways that make them resistant to bacterial breakdown and to the action of water. There are two main traditional tanning methods: vegetable tanning and brain tanning, each using completely different chemistry to achieve similar results. Vegetable tanning uses tannins, complex organic molecules found in high concentrations in certain tree barks, particularly oak, hemlock, and chestnut. The hides are soaked in progressively stronger solutions of tannins extracted by boiling bark in water. Over weeks or months, the tannins penetrate the hide and bond with the collagen proteins, creating a material that's firm, somewhat stiff, and has good resistance to water and decay. The color of vegetable tan leather ranges from pale tan to deep brown depending on the type of tannins used. This process is slow. A thick cowhide might require 6 months to a year to fully tan, but produces durable leather suitable for saddles, belts, shoes, and other demanding applications. Brain tanning is faster but more labor-intensive. Animal brains contain oils and lecithins that, when worked into a hide, coat the collagen fibers and make them soft and pliable. The chemistry is different from vegetable tanning. Instead of chemically linking proteins, brain tanning lubricates them. The result is soft, supple leather that breathes well, perfect for clothing. There's a remarkable rule of nature: every animal has sufficient brains to tan its own hide, meaning a deer brain can successfully tan a deer hide. The actual process involves removing all flesh and fat from the hide, soaking it in a solution made from mashed brain tissue, then working the hide, stretching and flexing it repeatedly as it dries to keep the fibers separate rather than letting them stick together. Brain tan leather isn't waterproof unless it's smoked, which is why many traditional brain tanned items are finished over smoke to both preserve them and make them water resistant. A third method, which became dominant in the modern era, is chrome tanning using chromium salts. This was developed in the late 19th century and revolutionized leather production because it's much faster than vegetable tanning. Hides can be completely tanned in days rather than months. However, chrome tanning produces toxic waste containing heavy metals, creating environmental problems that have led to efforts to develop cleaner tanning methods or return to traditional vegetable tanning. The tannery you're visiting uses traditional vegetable tanning, with dozens of hides soaking in wooden vats filled with progressively stronger tan solutions. The work is skilled. The tanner must judge when hides are ready to move to the next stronger solution, must control temperature and acidity, must work the leather at the right stages to achieve desired thickness and flexibility. The finished leather will be used for everything from bookbindings to horse harnesses, from shoe soles to aprons for blacksmiths and other craftspeople who need protection from heat and sparks. The pungent smell and unpleasant work environment of the tannery are the price of transforming animal byproducts into one of humanity's most useful materials. As evening approaches, we find ourselves in a meadow where mushrooms have appeared overnight, their caps pushing up through the grass in rings and scattered clusters. Autumn is the peak season for mushroom fruiting in many regions, and the sudden appearance of these fungi reveals a hidden world of biological activity happening beneath our feet. The mushrooms you see are just reproductive structures like apples on an apple tree, while the actual organism is a network of thread-like filaments called mycelium that spreads through the soil, sometimes covering acres and persisting for decades or even centuries. The fruiting body emerges when conditions are right. Adequate moisture, appropriate temperature, and sufficient nutrient availability. Autumn provides ideal conditions in many temperate regions. Summer's warmth has allowed the mycelium to grow extensively. Autumn rains provide moisture, and the cooling temperatures trigger fruiting in many species. The diversity of mushrooms is staggering. There may be 2 to 3 million fungal species, though only about 150,000 have been formally described by science. They play crucial ecological roles. Saprotrophic fungi decompose dead organic matter, returning nutrients to the soil. Mycorrhizal fungi form partnerships with plant roots, helping plants absorb water and nutrients while receiving sugars in return. And parasitic fungi attack living organisms, sometimes causing disease. For humans, mushrooms represent opportunity and danger in equal measure. Many species are delicious and nutritious, excellent sources of protein, vitamins, and minerals. Some have medicinal properties that modern research is validating, but many species are toxic, and some are deadly. The deadly Amanita species, including the aptly named Death Cap and Destroying Angel, cause the majority of fatal mushroom poisonings worldwide. These mushrooms contain amatoxins that destroy liver and kidney cells, and symptoms may not appear until days after consumption when damage is already irreversible. There's no antidote, and treatment is supportive care, hoping the patient survives long enough for their organs to regenerate. What makes Amanita mushrooms particularly dangerous is that they can resemble edible species and, according to those who've survived poisoning, they taste pleasant. Traditional mushroom identification wisdom is full of false rules. If it's bright colored, it's poisonous. False. Some bright mushrooms are edible and some dull mushrooms are deadly. If animals eat it, it's safe for humans. False. Rabbits can safely eat Amanita species that would kill humans. Cooking destroys toxins. False for most toxic compounds. The only reliable way to identify mushrooms is through careful examination of multiple characteristics: cap shape and color, gill attachment and spacing, spore print color, stem characteristics, presence or absence of a ring or vulva, growth location and host, and sometimes microscopic features. Even experienced mycologists occasionally make mistakes, which is why mushroom hunting carries inherent risk. However, some species are distinctive enough to be safely identified by careful amateurs. Morels, chanterelles, and hen of the woods have few dangerous lookalikes if you know what to look for. The mushrooms appearing in the meadow represent both the abundance of nature and the importance of knowledge. Knowing which species are safe and which are deadly is the difference between a delicious meal and a medical emergency. As twilight deepens into darkness, we make our way to the edge of the village where an orchard keeper is lighting smudge pots, small oil-burning devices that produce thick smoke. This is frost protection, an ancient agricultural practice that demonstrates both desperation and ingenuity. Late autumn frosts, particularly after a period of warm weather, can devastate fruit crops, and farmers have developed various methods to protect vulnerable plants. The smudge pots work through two mechanisms. The heat they produce raises the temperature in the immediate area slightly. But more importantly, the smoke particles serve as condensation nuclei, causing moisture in the air to condense into fog rather than frost. Fog, counterintuitively, can protect plants from frost because the condensation process releases latent heat, warming the air slightly, and because the fog layer acts as an insulating blanket, reducing radiative heat loss from the ground and plants. The effectiveness of smudge pots is limited, and the practice has largely been replaced by other methods in commercial agriculture. But it demonstrates the lengths to which farmers will go to protect their crops. Modern frost protection uses various techniques: wind machines that mix warmer air from above with cold air near the ground, irrigation systems that coat plants with ice. The freezing process releases latent heat that protects the plant tissue inside the ice coating, and even helicopters that hover over orchards to mix air layers. Each method has advantages and limitations, and all are expensive, only economically justified for high-value crops like fruit trees or grapevines. The physics of frost formation explains why some nights bring frost while others, equally cold, don't. Frost forms through radiative cooling on clear, calm nights. The Earth radiates heat into space, and this heat loss isn't balanced by incoming solar radiation or by mixing of air layers. Ground temperature can drop several degrees below air temperature measured at weather station height, and frost can form even when official temperatures are above freezing. This is why frost warnings specify clear skies and calm winds. Clouds reflect heat back to Earth and prevent the extreme radiative cooling, while wind mixes air layers and prevents the coldest air from settling at ground level. The timing of first killing frost is one of agriculture's crucial markers, defining the length of the growing season and determining which crops can be successfully grown in a region. Climate change is shifting these patterns, with killing frosts generally occurring later in autumn and last spring frosts occurring earlier, extending growing seasons but also creating unpredictability that challenges farmers who rely on historical patterns. The orchard keeper lighting smudge pots is fighting against physics and probability, trying to coax a few more days or weeks from the growing season, protecting trees that represent years of investment from a single night's cold that could damage or destroy next year's crop. As our evening walk concludes, we return to the village center where the church bell tolls, marking the hour and calling people to evening services. The sound of church bells has structured village life for over a millennium, and bells themselves represent a remarkable intersection of metallurgy, acoustics, and craftsmanship. A church bell is a carefully engineered musical instrument, typically cast from bell bronze, an alloy of approximately 78% copper and 22% tin, the same alloy ratio used for thousands of years because it produces the best sound. The shape of a bell is critical to its tone. Bells aren't simple cones but have complex profiles that took centuries of trial and error to perfect. The thickness varies from top to bottom in precise ratios, and even small deviations from ideal proportions produce per tone or dissonant overtones. When a bell is struck, it doesn't produce a single pure tone but a complex series of overtones. The strike note, the fundamental frequency you perceive as the bell's pitch, the hum tone an octave below, and various partial tones. A well-cast bell has these overtones in harmonic relationships that blend pleasingly. A poorly cast bell has dissonant partials that create an unpleasant clang. The casting of large bells is an art that borders on magic. A clay core is formed in the bell's internal shape, then covered with wax shaped to the bell's external profile, then covered with clay to form an outer mold. The wax is melted out, creating a cavity between the core and the outer mold, and molten bronze is poured into this cavity. The entire process must be perfect. The metal must be at exactly the right temperature. The molds must be completely dry, the pouring must be continuous without interruption, and the cooling must occur slowly and evenly. A single flaw can ruin a bell that weighs tons and represents months of work and enormous expense. Historical records document bell founders who failed repeatedly before achieving success, and some bell founding families kept their techniques secret for generations. The largest bells in the world weigh over 200 tons and required casting techniques pushing the absolute limits of pre-industrial technology. Bells served crucial functions beyond calling people to worship. They marked time in an era before personal timepieces. They sounded alarms for fire or invasion. They celebrated victories and mourned deaths, and their sound carried for miles, creating an acoustic commons that unified communities across distances. The particular sound of a village's bells became part of its identity, and travelers could often recognize where they were by the bell's distinctive tones. During wars, bells were sometimes melted down for their metal to cast cannons, and the loss of bells was mourned as the loss of community voice and identity. The sound of bells ringing in the autumn evening represents continuity with medieval and even ancient practices, a soundscape that has structured human life for millennia, marking time and calling communities together through the changing seasons. And so our seventh walk through this enduring autumn village draws to a close, the bells' echoes fading into the night, the smell of frost in the air promising winter's approach, and the ancient patterns of agricultural life continuing. Harvest completed, preservation underway, preparations for winter advancing, all proceeding in rhythms refined through countless generations, connecting us to the deep past while carrying forward into an uncertain future. As dawn breaks on another crisp autumn morning, we find ourselves walking through a field of corn stubble where a murder of crows has gathered, their cawing creating a raucous symphony in the still air. Crows are among the most intelligent birds on Earth, and autumn brings fascinating changes in their behavior that reveal sophisticated social structures and cognitive abilities. During breeding season, crows are territorial and aggressive, defending nesting areas from other crows. But as autumn arrives, this territoriality dissolves and crows begin gathering in large communal roosts that can contain thousands or even tens of thousands of individuals. These roosts serve multiple purposes that scientists are still working to fully understand. The prevailing theory is that roosts provide protection from predators or safety in numbers, with thousands of eyes watching for threats, and predators are overwhelmed by the sheer mass of potential prey, unable to single out individuals effectively. Roosts may also serve as information centers where crows that have found good food sources inadvertently reveal their knowledge through their behavior and physical condition, and unsuccessful foragers can follow successful ones to productive feeding areas the next day. The cognitive abilities of crows are remarkable and well documented through scientific research. Crows can recognize individual human faces and remember them for years. If a person threatens or harms a crow, that crow will remember and respond with alarm calls when it sees that person again, even years later. Even more impressively, crows can communicate this information to other crows who have never encountered the threat, creating a cultural transmission of knowledge. Researchers who trapped and banded crows while wearing distinctive masks found that crows would scold and mob anyone wearing those masks, even crows that had never been trapped themselves. Crows use tools, a behavior once thought unique to humans and a few primates. New Caledonian crows fashion hooks from twigs to extract insects from crevices, and they can solve multi-step problems requiring them to use one tool to obtain another tool needed to reach food. In laboratory settings, crows have demonstrated understanding of water displacement, dropping stones into a tube of water to raise the water level and bring floating food within reach. essentially recreating Aesop's fable of the crow and the pitcher. They understand concepts like object permanence and can plan for future needs rather than just responding to immediate circumstances. The autumn gathering of crows you're witnessing represents not just a collection of individual birds but a complex social network with learned behaviors, cultural transmission, and problem-solving abilities that challenge our assumptions about animal intelligence. The relationship between humans and crows is ancient and complex. They've been viewed as omens, tricksters, and harbingers of death in various cultures, yet they're also recognized as clever, adaptable survivors who thrive in human-modified landscapes. The crows foraging in the corn stubble, calling to each other with vocalizations that may convey specific information about food or threats, are operating with cognitive sophistication that rivals many mammals and reminds us that intelligence evolved multiple times, in multiple lineages, creating minds very different from our own yet still capable of learning, remembering, and adapting. Walking on through the morning mist, we come to a hedgerow heavy with clusters of elderberries, their dark purple-black fruits hanging in umbrella-shaped bunches. A villager is carefully harvesting these berries, which have been used for food and medicine for thousands of years. Elderberries represent both the generosity of autumn and the importance of traditional knowledge, because while the berries are edible and beneficial, other parts of the elder plant are toxic. The berries themselves contain compounds called anthocyanins, the same pigments that give many autumn leaves their red and purple colors, and these compounds have potent antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties that modern research has validated. Studies have shown that elderberry extract can reduce the duration and severity of cold and flu symptoms, and the traditional use of elderberry syrup for respiratory infections has scientific support. However, raw elderberries contain small amounts of cyanogenic glycosides, compounds that release cyanide when digested. The amounts are low enough that eating a handful of raw berries is unlikely to cause serious harm, but consuming large quantities can cause nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Cooking destroys these compounds, which is why elderberries are traditionally cooked into syrups, jams, and wines rather than eaten raw. The leaves, stems, roots, and unripe berries contain much higher concentrations of these toxic compounds and should never be consumed. This pattern, useful parts alongside toxic parts in the same plant, is common in traditional medicinal and food plants, and it illustrates why detailed traditional knowledge was essential for survival. People had to learn through careful observation and undoubtedly through tragic trial and error exactly which parts of which plants could be used and how they needed to be prepared. This knowledge was encoded in cultural practices and passed down through generations. The harvesting of elderberries you're witnessing follows rules refined over centuries. Take only the ripe, dark berries, leaving the stems and leaves. Collect them in autumn when fully mature. Cook them thoroughly before consumption. The elder tree itself has deep roots in European folklore and traditional medicine. It was considered both protective and dangerous. Planting an elder near your house would protect it from lightning and evil spirits, but cutting down an elder without permission from the elder mother, a spirit believed to inhabit the tree, would bring misfortune. These beliefs, which seem like superstition to modern people, may have served practical purposes. They ensured that useful elder trees were protected and remained available in the landscape. The medicinal uses of elder extended beyond the berries. Elder flowers were made into tea for fevers and respiratory complaints, and they're still used commercially in beverages and cosmetics. Elder flower water was a traditional skin treatment, and the hollow stems of elder branches were used to make simple musical instruments and even pop guns for children's play. The versatility of this single plant species, providing food, medicine, materials, and cultural significance, demonstrates the deep relationship between traditional peoples and their plant communities. A relationship that modern society has largely lost, but that still persists in practices like the elderberry harvest you're observing. The morning walk brings us to a fascinating sight. A pair of villagers using a two-person saw to fell a large tree, their movements synchronized in a practiced rhythm. This crosscut saw, also called a felling saw when used to cut down standing trees, represents technology that seems simple but embodies sophisticated understanding of materials and mechanics. The saw blade is typically 5 to 7 feet long with large teeth that alternate in their set. Some teeth are bent slightly to the left, others to the right. This creates a curve, the channel cut by the saw slightly wider than the blade thickness, preventing the blade from binding in the cut. But the real sophistication is in how the saw works. Unlike modern power saws that remove material through rapid rotation, or even hand saws that cut primarily on the push stroke, a crosscut saw is designed to cut only on the pull stroke. Each sawyer pulls the saw through the wood, then relaxes as their partner pulls it back, then pulls again. This rhythm is crucial. If both people push, the blade bows and binds. The saw must be pulled taut but not over-tensioned, and the motion must be smooth rather than jerky. Experienced sawyers can maintain this rhythm for hours, making steady progress through enormous trees. The teeth themselves come in different patterns for different purposes. Champion tooth pattern has cutting teeth interspersed with raker teeth. The cutting teeth score the wood fibers on each side of the curve, while the raker teeth scoop out the wood between these scores. This pattern works well in green wood. Perforated lens tooth pattern has teeth that both cut and clear wood, better for dry or frozen wood. The metallurgy matters too. The blade must be hard enough to hold an edge but flexible enough not to shatter. Traditional sawmakers used specific steel alloys and heat treating processes that were closely guarded trade secrets. A well-made crosscut saw, properly maintained, could last for decades of hard use. Maintaining these saws required skill. They had to be regularly sharpened with specialized files, and the set of the teeth, their alternating left-right bend, had to be maintained with a tool called the saw set. The sound of a crosscut saw working through wood is distinctive, a rhythmic rasping that echoes through forests, punctuated by the sawyer's breathing and occasional brief words coordinating their effort. Before chainsaws became common in the mid-20th century, all timber harvesting and most firewood cutting was done with crosscut saws and axes. Old photographs show logging camps with enormous saws, some 12 feet or longer, used by multiple sawyers to fell massive old-growth trees. The labor was brutal, and the danger was substantial. Falling trees, rolling logs, and saw accidents caused numerous injuries and deaths. The introduction of chainsaws revolutionized forestry, reducing the labor and danger dramatically, but it also eliminated a skilled craft and changed the acoustic environment of forests, from the rasp of saws and ring of axes to the mechanical scream of gasoline engines. The two sawyers you're watching, working in coordinated rhythm, are practicing a craft that's increasingly rare, maintaining traditions and skills that connect directly to the earliest days of human tree-felling technology. As we continue through the village, we pass a yard where a woman is carding wool, using two flat paddles covered with fine wire hooks to align wool fibers before spinning. This is one of the essential steps in transforming raw fleece into usable yarn, and it reveals the remarkable properties of wool and the ingenuity required to process it. Wool straight from a sheep is greasy with lanolin, contains vegetable matter from the fields, and is often dirty with mud and manure. The first step in processing is skirting, removing the worst soiled wool from the fleece edges. Then comes washing or scouring, which removes dirt and excess lanolin, though some lanolin is typically left because it helps with spinning and makes the finished yarn somewhat water-resistant. The clean wool must then have its fibers aligned so they can be spun into yarn. And this is where carding comes in. The cards, those paddles covered with wire hooks, work by catching fibers and pulling them in different directions until they're lying parallel. The process looks simple but requires skill and patience. Too aggressive and you tear the fibers. too gentle and they don't align properly. The carded wool emerges as a bat or roll like a loose, fluffy mass of aligned fibers ready for spinning. The fiber alignment is crucial for spinning because it allows fibers to slide past each other and lock together as twist is introduced. Wool is an extraordinary material from a technical perspective. Each fiber is covered with microscopic scales that overlap like roof shingles, and these scales interlock when wool is agitated with heat and moisture, causing wool to felt to form a dense, matted fabric. This property is both useful. Felted wool makes excellent insulation and waterproof fabric, and problematic wool garments can shrink and become unwearable if washed improperly. Wool fibers are also crimped. They have a natural wave that creates air pockets in spun yarn and woven fabric, making wool an excellent insulator. Wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture while still feeling dry to the touch, which is why wool garments remain comfortable across a wide range of temperatures and humidity levels. The chemistry of wool involves keratin proteins, the same proteins that form human hair and fingernails. These proteins contain sulfur bonds that give wool its elasticity. Wool can be stretched significantly and will return to its original shape. Different sheep breeds produce wool with different characteristics. Merino sheep produce fine, soft wool prized for clothing worn next to skin. Leicester breeds produce long, lustrous fibers excellent for worsted spinning. Shetland sheep produce wool with a wide range of natural colors from white through grays and browns to black. Before the Industrial Revolution, wool processing was one of the most important and widespread crafts. Every farm household processed wool for their own clothing and bedding, and commercial wool production was a major industry in many regions. The English economy in medieval and Renaissance periods was largely built on wool exports, and the Lord Chancellor's seat in the House of Lords is still called the woolsack, a tradition dating from when the wool trade was Britain's primary source of wealth. The woman carding wool in her yard is continuing a tradition that stretches back to the earliest domestication of sheep approximately 10,000 years ago, transforming raw animal fiber into material that will be spun, dyed, knitted, or woven and worn, a transformation that requires multiple specialized skills and tools developed and refined over millennia. The afternoon finds us at a mill pond where preparations are being made for winter. The miller is adjusting the pond level and checking the sluice gates that control water flow to the mill wheel. Mill ponds are carefully engineered water management systems, and understanding their function reveals sophisticated hydraulic knowledge developed long before formal engineering education existed. A mill pond serves as a water reservoir that ensures consistent flow to the mill wheel even when the stream feeding it varies in volume. During autumn and spring, when stream flow is high, excess water flows over the pond's spillway, bypassing the mill. During summer or drought periods, when stream flow decreases, the stored water in the pond can be released through the sluice to maintain mill operation. The pond also allows water level adjustment based on the work being done. Heavy grinding requires maximum water flow and thus maximum head pressure, the height difference between pond surface and mill wheel, while lighter work can use less water. The construction of a mill pond required understanding hydrology, geology, and structural engineering. The dam creating the pond had to be built on solid foundation material, bedrock or dense clay, to prevent undermining and failure. The spillway had to be designed to safely pass flood flows without overtopping the dam or causing erosion. The sluice gates had to be constructed to withstand constant water pressure while still being operable for flow control. Historical mill ponds were typically earthen dams, built by piling soil and clay and compacting it through trampling by livestock or even by having workers dance on it in a practice called puddling. The upstream face was often lined with clay to make it watertight, and the downstream face was gentled, slopped, and planted with grass to prevent erosion. Stone spillways channeled overflow safely around or over the dam. These structures required constant maintenance. Leaks had to be found and sealed. Erosion had to be repaired. and sediment gradually accumulating in the pond had to be periodically removed by draining the pond and dredging. The ecological impacts of mill ponds were and remain significant. The pond creates wetland and aquatic habitat where previously there was only a stream, often increasing wildlife diversity. However, the dam also blocks fish migration, and this was recognized even in medieval times. Some mill dams were required to include fish ladders or to be opened during spawning season to allow fish passage. Mill ponds moderate stream flow, reducing flood peaks and maintaining base flow during dry periods, which can benefit downstream users, but they also trap sediments that would otherwise travel downstream, potentially changing stream and river dynamics far below the mill. In many regions, thousands of small mill ponds were built during the agricultural and industrial revolution periods, fundamentally reshaping the hydrology of entire watersheds. Most have now been abandoned, and many have been intentionally removed to restore natural stream flow and fish passage, but thousands remain, still serving their original purposes or repurposed for recreation or water supply. The miller you're watching, managing his pond for winter, is operating a system that represents some of humanity's earliest large-scale landscape engineering, using principles of hydrology and hydraulics that remain valid in modern dam construction. As evening approaches, we come upon a remarkable sight in the village square. An itinerant knife grinder has set up his equipment, and villagers are bringing knives, scissors, and tools for sharpening. The grinder's apparatus is a fascinating piece of specialized equipment, a grinding wheel powered by a treadle that the grinder operates with his foot, leaving his hands free to hold and angle the blade being sharpened. Knife sharpening is a skill that seems straightforward but involves understanding metallurgy, geometry, and physics. A sharp blade isn't simply thin at the edge, it has a specific geometry where two planes meet at a precise angle, and the metal at this edge must be hard enough to resist deformation but not so hard that it becomes brittle and chips. Different tools require different edge angles. A razor or a scalpel might have a 10 to 15 degree angle per side for maximum sharpness. A kitchen knife typically has 15 to 20 degrees for a balance of sharpness and durability, and a hatchet or machete might have 25 to 30 degrees because it needs to withstand impact. The grinder must know these angles by feel and eye, maintaining consistent angle through the entire sharpening process. The grinding wheel itself is carefully selected coarse wheels for removing metal quickly when repairing damaged edges, fine wheels for final edge refinement. Traditional wheels were natural sandstone, carefully quarried and shaped. The stone had to be uniform in grain and composition. Inconsistencies would create uneven sharpening. The wheel ran through a water trough, so its lower portion was constantly wetted, and this water served multiple purposes. It cooled the metal. Being ground, excessive heat can ruin the temper of a blade, making it soft and unable to hold an edge. It carried away metal particles and stone grit, and it prevented dust that would be harmful to breathe. The skill of the knife grinder was recognized and valued. A skilled grinder could restore badly damaged blades to service and could maintain edges to precise specifications. Different cultures developed different sharpening traditions. Japanese sword polishing is an elaborate multi-week process using progression of increasingly fine stones, producing edges of extraordinary sharpness and blades polished to mirror surfaces. European scythe sharpening used long, thin whetstones called scythe stones that could be carried in the field and used to touch up the edge periodically during mowing. The itinerant knife grinder tradition that you're witnessing was common in Europe and America from the Middle Ages through the early 20th century. The grinder would travel from village to village or through urban neighborhoods, announcing his presence with a distinctive call or bell, and set up temporarily in a central location. People would bring items to be sharpened and wait while the work was done. The grinder's fee was modest, a few coins per blade, but he could sharpen dozens of items in a day, making a living through volume. The profession declined with the rise of cheap, disposable blades and home sharpening tools. but never disappeared entirely. Today's knife grinders are typically specialized craftspeople serving professional users, chefs, butchers, carpenters who require precision sharpening that home methods can't achieve. The shower of sparks as the grinder works a blade against a spinning wheel, the rasp and hiss of metal on stone, and the careful testing of the edge with a thumb are all elements of a craft practiced for as long as humans have used metal tools, essential to keeping the implements of work and daily life functional. As darkness gathers, we find ourselves at the village chandlery where candles are being made in preparation for the long winter nights ahead. Candle making is one of humanity's oldest crafts, and the process reveals interesting chemistry and material science. The most common traditional candle materials were tallow-rendered animal fat and beeswax, with very different properties and uses. Tallow candles were the common person's light source, cheap and readily available from slaughtered livestock, but with significant drawbacks. Tallow is a complex mixture of triglycerides, fat molecules with melting points that vary depending on the animal source and diet. Beef tallow produces the best candles, firmer and higher melting than mutton or pork fat, but even the best tallow candles are soft, produce a smoky flame with an unpleasant smell, and provide relatively dim, flickering light. Beeswax candles are superior in every way. They burn cleanly with almost no smoke or odor, produce a bright, steady flame, and smell faintly of honey. However, beeswax was expensive, sometimes worth its weight in silver, and thus was reserved for churches and wealthy households. The chemistry of burning involves oxidation. The candle wax doesn't burn directly as a solid. Instead, the flame's heat melts wax, which is then drawn up the wick through capillary action, the same phenomenon that draws water up a paper towel. At the top of the wick, intense heat vaporizes the liquid wax, and these wax vapors combust with oxygen in the air, producing heat, light, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. The wick is crucial. It must be thick enough to draw sufficient fuel for a good flame, but not so thick that it draws too much fuel and causes smoking. Cotton and linen make good wicks because they burn slowly and curl as they char, which brings the tip into the hotter part of the flame where it's consumed, creating a self-trimming effect. Traditional tallow candles required frequent trimming, snipping the charred wick with special scissors called candle snuffers, or the flame would become dim and smoky. The process of making dipped candles is simple but tedious. Wicks are suspended from a frame, dipped into melted wax, removed and allowed to cool until the wax solidifies, then dipped again. The process repeats dozens of times, gradually building up layers until the candle reaches desired thickness. Each dip must be timed precisely. Dip too soon while the previous layer is still soft and it will drip off. Wait too long and the new layer won't adhere properly. Molded candles are faster to produce. Wax is poured into molds containing pre-positioned wicks, allowed to cool and shrink slightly, then removed. But molds were expensive, usually made of metal or expensive hardwood, and represented significant capital investment. The amount of light provided by candles is surprisingly small by modern standards. A single candle produces about 12 lumens of light. For comparison, a modern 60-watt incandescent bulb produces about 800 lumens. Reading by candlelight was difficult and eye-straining. Detailed work like sewing was nearly impossible, and entire households might share a few candles in the evening, gathering in one room to benefit from the combined light. The cost of lighting was substantial in pre-industrial societies. A household might spend 10 to 20% of its income on candles and lamp oil, far more than modern families spend on electricity. The development of whale oil lamps, then kerosene lamps, then gas lighting, and finally electric lighting each represented revolutionary improvements in quality and cost of illumination. The chandler you're watching, dipping wicks into melted wax with practiced rhythm, is creating products that will provide the primary light source for many village households through the winter. continuing a craft that dates back thousands of years and that remained essential until the late 19th century when newer technologies made candles obsolete for general lighting, though they persist for decorative and ceremonial purposes. As we walk through the darkened village streets lit only by occasional candle glow from windows, we hear an unusual sound, the howling of wolves in the distant forest. Wolves were once common across Europe and North America, and autumn was when they became most noticeable and problematic for farming communities. Understanding the relationship between wolves and agricultural societies reveals complex ecological and cultural dynamics. Wolves are apex predators with complex social structures and sophisticated hunting strategies. They live in packs typically consisting of a mated pair, the alphas, their offspring from multiple years, and occasionally unrelated adults. The pack hunts cooperatively, which allows them to take prey much larger than themselves. A wolf pack can successfully hunt elk, moose, or bison many times the weight of individual wolves. This cooperative hunting is possible because wolves have remarkable stamina, sophisticated communication, and the ability to coordinate complex strategies. They can pursue prey for hours or even days, taking turns leading the chase while others rest. They communicate through vocalizations, including the famous howl, which serves to locate pack members and claim territory. Body language and scent marking. For agricultural societies, wolves represented significant threat and loss. A wolf that learned to kill livestock could devastate a farmer's animals. Sheep and goats were particularly vulnerable, but wolves would also kill cattle, horses, and pigs. A single wolf could kill multiple animals in one attack, more than it could possibly eat, in behavior called surplus killing. This occurs when prey animals are confined and cannot flee. The predator's hunting instinct continues, triggering as long as fleeing prey is available. In the wild, surplus killing rarely occurs because prey escapes once the predator kills enough to satiate. But in a sheep pen, the penned animals trigger continuous hunting behavior. The economic impact was severe enough that agricultural societies across the world developed intensive wolf control programs. Bounties were paid for killed wolves, professional wolf hunters were employed, and wolves were systematically hunted, trapped, and poisoned. By the early 20th century, wolves had been exterminated from most of their historical range in the United States and Western Europe. Only recently have wolf populations begun recovering, through natural recodify in some areas and active reintroduction programs in others. This recovery has created conflicts between conservation and agricultural interests that remain contentious. Modern ecological understanding has revealed wolves' crucial role in ecosystem regulation. They control prey populations, change prey behavior in ways that reduce overgrazing, and create carcasses that feed scavengers. The reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in 1995-96 triggered a trophic cascade. Elk populations decreased and became more wary, spending less time in riparian areas, which allowed willows and aspens to recover, which increased beaver populations, which created ponds that supported numerous other species. The wolf's presence essentially restructured the entire ecosystem, but this ecological value provides little comfort to ranchers who lose livestock to wolf predation. The challenge is finding ways for wolves and agricultural activities to coexist. Compensation programs for killed livestock, non-lethal deterrents like guard dogs and flattery flagging that wolves avoid, and zoning that separates wolf habitat from intensive livestock operations. The howling you hear in the distance represents both a wilderness that once covered the landscape and a conflict that continues between human land use and wildlife conservation, a conflict without easy resolutions but with profound implications for both ecological health and human livelihoods. As our evening walk concludes, We return to a farmhouse where the family is gathered around the hearth, the youngest children already asleep while adults and older children work on various tasks by firelight. Someone is braiding corn husks into mats, another is mending harness, another is repairing a basket. This scene of evening work represents a fundamental reality of pre-industrial life. Productivity couldn't stop when field work ended because there were always tasks requiring attention, and winters and forced idleness meant that autumn evenings should be used for preparation and repair. The braiding of corn husks into mats is one of countless ways agricultural societies found uses for every part of their crops. Corn husks, which would otherwise be waste, make excellent material for weaving because they're flexible when damp, strong when dry, and naturally water resistant. Corn husk mats were used as floor coverings, mattress filling, horse collars, and even rain capes in some cultures. The husks could also be twisted into rope, woven into baskets, or used to stuff scarecrows. Native American peoples developed elaborate traditions of corn husk crafts, creating intricate dolls, masks, and containers. Early American colonists learned these techniques and integrated them into their own material culture. The practice of evening handwork while gathered around a fire served social functions beyond simple productivity. It was when stories were told, songs were sung, news was shared, and children learned both practical skills and cultural knowledge. The rhythm of handwork, the repetitive motions of braiding, sewing, or carving created a meditative state conducive to conversation and storytelling. Multi-generational knowledge transfer happened naturally in these settings. A grandmother teaching a child to braid, a father showing a son how to sharpen tools, a mother instructing daughters in needlework. These weren't formal lessons but simply life being lived and skills being used, with younger generations absorbing knowledge through observation and participation. The artificial separation of learning from productive work is a modern development. In traditional societies, education and labor were inseparable. The long winter evenings ahead will see much more of this household work: spinning, weaving, tool making, food preparation, and countless repair tasks that keep a household functional. The pace is slower than modern life, but not necessarily less productive when measured properly. A skilled spinner could produce thread continuously for hours, accumulating substantial quantities. A woodcarver could fashion tool handles, spoons, or decorative items. The household's collective evening output over a winter was considerable. This pattern of life-intense agricultural labor from spring through autumn, followed by winter months of handwork, repair, and craft production, shaped human cultures for thousands of years and remains embedded in cultural memory and traditions even in societies that have completely mechanized agriculture and moved away from household production. And so our eighth walk through this timeless autumn village draws to a close, the night deepening around the scattered lights of hearth fires, the work of the day giving way to the work of the evening, and the ancient patterns of agricultural life continuing. Harvest stored, preservation ongoing, evening hours filled with productive handwork, all proceeding in rhythms as old as settled human life, connecting us across the centuries to countless generations who lived by these same seasonal patterns. As morning mist rises from the fields on this late autumn day, we find ourselves walking along a stone fence where wild grapevines have climbed, their leaves now turned brilliant scarlet and gold. A few clusters of small, dark grapes still cling to the vines, and if you taste one, you'll find it intensely tart, almost astringent, yet somehow appealing. These wild grapes, Vitis labrusca and related species native to North America, are fundamentally different from the European wine grapes that dominate viticulture, and their story reveals fascinating insights about plant domestication and terroir. Wild grapes have what wine experts call a foxy flavor, a distinctive musky quality that comes from a chemical compound called methyl anthranilate. This compound is absent or present only in trace amounts in European wine grapes Vitis vinifera, and its polarizing people either love it or find it off-putting. The famous Concord grape, used for juice and jelly, is a cultivated variety of wild American grape, and that distinctive grape juice flavor is essentially concentrated methyl anthranilate. Early European settlers in North America attempted to grow European wine grape varieties for wine production, but they failed repeatedly. The vines would grow for a season or two, then mysteriously decline and die. The settlers had no way of knowing that their vines were being killed by phylloxera and other Native American pests and diseases to which European grapes had no resistance. They concluded that the climate or soil was unsuitable for wine grapes, which was ironic given that wild grapes grew abundantly all around them. Eventually, winemakers began working with native grape varieties and hybrids between American and European species, creating wines that were distinctly different from European wines but perfectly suited to American conditions. These American grapes and hybrids formed the foundation of early American wine industry, particularly in the eastern United States. The development of resistant rootstock grafting European wine grape varieties onto American rootstock eventually allowed European varieties to be grown successfully in many regions, but American grapes and hybrids never disappeared entirely. They remain important in regions with harsh winters or high disease pressure where European varieties struggle. The flavor differences between grape species reflect their evolutionary histories. The compounds that give each species its characteristic flavor likely evolved as defenses against insects, fungi, or other threats, and they reflect the specific ecological pressures in each plant's native range. The fact that humans find some of these defensive compounds pleasant while others are considered flaws demonstrates the arbitrary nature of taste. There's nothing objectively superior about European grape flavors versus American grape flavors, yet centuries of European wine tradition have created a set of expectations that define wine-like flavors in ways that exclude the foxy character of American grapes. The wild grapes hanging on the fence represent a road not taken in American viticulture, a different path that produces different but not necessarily inferior wines, and a reminder that the plants we cultivate carry within them the histories of their wild ancestors and the landscapes that shaped them. Walking further, we come upon a small stream where a villager is collecting watercress, the bright green plants growing in the clear, cold water. Watercress is one of the few green vegetables available fresh in autumn and even into winter, and it has been valued as both food and medicine for thousands of years. The plant's peppery flavor comes from compounds called glucosinolates, the same family of chemicals that gives mustard, horseradish, and wasabi their distinctive bite. When you chew watercress, enzymes in the plant cells come into contact with the glucosinolates and break them down into isothiocyanates. These are the compounds you actually taste, and they're what gives watercress its characteristic sharp flavor. But these compounds aren't just flavor, they're defensive chemicals that protect the plant from herbivorous insects and have antimicrobial properties. Fascinatingly, modern research has shown that many of these compounds have significant health benefits for humans. Isothiocyanates have been linked to reduced cancer risk, improved cardiovascular health, and anti-inflammatory effects. The ancient practice of eating watercress for health, it was recommended by Hippocrates and was supposedly grown near hospitals in ancient Greece, has substantial scientific support. Watercress is extraordinarily nutrient-dense, containing more vitamin C by weight than oranges, more calcium than milk, more iron than spinach, and high levels of vitamin K, beta-carotene, and numerous other beneficial compounds. In fact, by a CDC nutrient density scoring system, watercress ranks as the most nutrient-dense food, scoring perfect 100 out of 100. But watercress harvesting carries a significant risk that makes the practice dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Liver flukes. These parasitic flatworms have a complex life cycle that involves snails as intermediate hosts and mammals as final hosts. The flukes produce cysts that attach to aquatic plants, including watercress, and if these cysts are consumed by humans, they can mature into adult flukes in the liver and bile ducts, causing a disease called fascioliasis. Symptoms include abdominal pain, fever, and liver damage, and severe cases can be life-threatening. The traditional solution to this risk was to only harvest watercress from flowing water, not stagnant ponds where livestock don't graze upstream, and to thoroughly cook it before eating. Cooking kills the cysts, making the watercress safe. Raw watercress salad is only safe if you're absolutely certain of the source and can verify that no livestock have access to the water upstream. This is a perfect example of how traditional foods come with traditional knowledge about safe harvesting and preparation, and how losing this knowledge creates risk. The villager harvesting watercress knows which streams are safe, knows to take only the vibrant green growth and leave yellowed or damaged plants, and knows that this harvest will be thoroughly cooked into soup or wilted into a side dish. The watercress represents one of nature's most generous autumn gifts, fresh green nutrition available when most plants have died back, but also a reminder that foraging requires knowledge, not just identification skills but understanding of ecology, parasitology, and proper preparation methods. As we continue our walk, we notice substantial numbers of spiders and their webs everywhere, stretched between fence posts, spanning gaps and hedgerows, and covering the stubble fields with sheets of silk that glisten with dew. Autumn is peak spider season in many temperate regions, and understanding why reveals the complexities of arthropod life cycles and ecology. Most spider species in temperate climates hatch from eggs in spring, spend summer growing through multiple molts, and reach maturity in late summer or early autumn. The large orb weaver spiders that are so conspicuous now were tiny and nearly invisible earlier in the year. Autumn is their time to reproduce. The large individuals you see are primarily females who have reached their maximum size and are building webs to catch the flying insects still active in the cooling weather. Male spiders, typically much smaller than females, are actively searching for females to mate with, which is why you sometimes see small spiders on webs with much larger ones. Spider reproduction is remarkable and often involves considerable risk for males. In many species, the female is larger and more powerful than the male, and sexual cannibalism, where the female eats the male during or after mating, is common in some species, though less universal than popular culture suggests. Males have evolved various strategies to reduce this risk, approaching only when the female has just captured prey and is feeding, offering a gift of wrapped prey to distract the female, or attempting to mate while the female is molting and temporarily vulnerable. After successful mating, females of most temperate species lay eggs in silk egg sacs that are hidden in protected locations under bark, in leaf litter, or attached to buildings. The female often dies with the first hard freeze, but her eggs survive winter and hatch in spring, continuing the cycle. The webs themselves are marvels of material science and engineering. Spider silk is one of the strongest materials known by weight. It's stronger than steel and more elastic than nylon. A strand of spider silk as thick as a pencil could theoretically stop a Boeing 747 in flight, though obviously no spider could produce such a quantity. Spiders produce multiple types of silk from different glands, each with different properties. Strong dragline silk for the web's framework and for safety lines, sticky capture spiral silk to trap insects, tough silk for egg sacs, and fine silk for wrapping prey. The orb web design. The classic spiral spider web is an optimization of material and function. The radial threads provide structural support and aren't sticky, allowing the spider to move across them freely. The spiral threads are coated with sticky droplets that trap insects. The entire web weighs only a few milligrams but can stop insects traveling at high speed. Different spider species build different web architectures. Sheet webs that form horizontal platforms, funnel webs with retreat tubes, tangle webs with three-dimensional structure, and many species don't build webs at all but actively hunt. The ecological importance of spiders is enormous. They're major predators of insects, and research suggests that spiders worldwide consume 400 to 800 million tons of insects and other prey annually, more than the total weight of all humans on Earth. In agricultural settings, spiders provide significant pest control, and studies have shown that fields with healthy spider populations have reduced crop damage from insect pests. The abundance of spiders you're seeing in this autumn landscape represents a peak in the annual cycle, the culmination of a season's growth and the preparation for reproduction that will yield next year's generation. The afternoon brings us to a small clearing where a charcoal burner is tending his operation, a large mound of earth covering stacked wood that's slowly transforming into charcoal through carefully controlled burning. Charcoal production is an ancient craft that converts wood into a fuel superior in many ways to the original material, and the process involves sophisticated understanding of combustion chemistry. Charcoal is nearly pure carbon, created by heating wood in the absence of sufficient oxygen to allow complete combustion. In a normal fire, wood burns completely, combining with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, water vapor, and heat. But in charcoal production, the wood is heated to high temperature while oxygen is restricted, driving off volatile compounds, water, organic acids, methane, and complex hydrocarbons while leaving behind the carbon structure. The result is a fuel that burns much hotter than wood, produces little smoke, and is much lighter to transport. Charcoal is about 1/3 the weight of the wood used to produce it. The charcoal mound or clamp you're seeing is the traditional production method. Wood is carefully stacked in a dome shape, often around a central chimney structure. The pile is covered with turf, leaves, or earth to restrict airflow, leaving only small vents at top and bottom. The pile is ignited through the central chimney, and then the charcoal burner's skill becomes critical. He must maintain the burn at exactly the right rate by adjusting the vents. Too much air and the wood burns completely to ash. Too little air and the process stalls. The burn takes days or even weeks depending on the pile size, and the burner must tend it constantly, living in a temporary shelter beside the mound, monitoring the smoke color and adjusting vents. When smoke is thick and white, moisture and volatiles are being driven off. As it becomes thin and blue, carbonization is nearly complete. When the smoke clears entirely, the vents are sealed completely to smother any remaining fire, and the mound is allowed to cool, which can take several days. Opening the mound too early allows air to reach the hot charcoal, which can cause it to burst into flame and be consumed. Charcoal has been essential to human civilization for thousands of years. Bronze and iron smelting require temperatures higher than wood fires can achieve, but charcoal fires can reach the necessary temperatures. Before coke produced from coal became available, all metal smelting and forging used charcoal. The demand was enormous. Producing 1 ton of iron in a traditional bloomery furnace required about 20 tons of wood converted to charcoal. This demand drove deforestation across Europe and parts of Asia, and charcoal production was regulated by law in many regions to prevent complete forest destruction. Sustainable charcoal production requires coppicing, cutting trees to ground level and allowing them to regrow from the stump, producing multiple stems that can be harvested on rotation. A well-managed coppice woodland can produce charcoal indefinitely without depleting the forest. The charcoal burner's craft was traditionally itinerant. The burner would move to where wood was available, construct temporary mounds, produce charcoal, then move on. The work was skilled but lowly paid and socially marginal, and charcoal burners often lived isolated from communities, giving rise to various superstitions and folk beliefs about them. The charcoal burner you're watching Tending his smoking mound in the forest clearing is practicing a craft that connects directly to the earliest days of metallurgy and that remained essential to industry until coal and later petroleum products replaced charcoal in most applications. As we walk on, the afternoon light reveals something beautiful. A massive spider web stretched across a gap in a stone wall, and caught in the web are thousands of tiny seeds, each with a tuft of silky fibers that allowed it to be carried on the wind. These are thistle seeds, and their presence in this web demonstrates one of autumn's most important ecological processes: seed dispersal. Plants, being immobile, face a fundamental challenge in reproduction. They must somehow transport their seeds away from the parent plant to find suitable growing sites and avoid competing with siblings. Different plants have evolved a remarkable array of seed dispersal strategies. The thistle seeds caught in the web use wind dispersal. Each seed is attached to a pappus, a structure of fine, feathery bristles that acts like a parachute, allowing the seed to be carried considerable distances by even gentle breezes. Dandelions use the same strategy with their familiar blowball seed heads. Wind dispersal requires specific seed characteristics. The seeds must be small and light. A heavy seed would fall quickly despite having a parachute, and they must be produced in large numbers because dispersal is random and most seeds will land in unsuitable locations. A single thistle plant might produce thousands of seeds, and only a tiny fraction will germinate successfully. Other plants use different dispersal strategies equally sophisticated. Burdock produces seeds in burrs covered with tiny hooks that catch in animal fur or clothing, essentially hitchhiking to new locations. This inspired the invention of Velcro when Swiss engineer Georges de Mestral examined burrs caught in his dog's fur under a microscope and realized the hook and loop principle could be replicated artificially. Many plants produce fleshy fruits that animals eat, and the seeds pass through the animal's digestive system unharmed and are deposited with a portion of fertilizer. Some seeds have hard coats that require passage through an animal gut to be scarified, scratched, or weakened before they can germinate. Birds are particularly important fruit dispersers. They can carry seeds long distances and often distribute them into appropriate habitats. Some plants use explosive dispersal. When the seed pod dries, it builds up tension and suddenly splits, flinging seeds several feet from the parent plant. Touch me not impatient species has seed pods that explode when touched, and witch hazel has a similar mechanism. Plants growing near water often use water dispersal. Coconuts famously float and can travel thousands of miles on ocean currents, and many riverside plants produce seeds that float and are carried downstream. The timing of seed dispersal is carefully orchestrated. Many trees disperse seeds in autumn when they mature, but they've evolved different strategies within this general pattern. Oak acorns fall and must germinate quickly or be eaten by wildlife. They're designed for short-distance dispersal and immediate germination. Maple samaras, the helicopters beloved by children, spin as they fall, which slows their descent and allows wind to carry them some distance from the parent tree, and they can lie dormant through winter before germinating in spring. The seeds caught in the spider web will likely never germinate. Their journey has ended prematurely, but thousands more from the same thistle plant are still traveling, and a few will find suitable locations, germinate, and grow into new plants, perpetuating the cycle. The beautiful convergence of spider web and thistle seeds is a chance encounter between two unrelated biological strategies, creating a moment of aesthetic appeal from purely functional structures. As evening approaches, we come to a village brewery where the autumn ale is being brewed. The brewhouse is filled with steam and the rich, almost bread-like aroma of mashing grain. Brewing is one of humanity's oldest and most sophisticated biotechnologies, and autumn has traditionally been an important brewing season. Beer is essentially a controlled fermentation of grain sugars by yeast, but the process involves multiple steps, each requiring specific knowledge and techniques. It begins with malting grain, traditionally barley, But sometimes wheat or other grains is soaked in water until it begins to germinate, which activates enzymes that convert the grain's starches into sugars that yeast can ferment. The germination is stopped by heating kilning the grain, which also develops flavors and colors depending on temperature and time. Light kilning produces pale malts for light-colored beers, while higher temperatures produce darker malts with roasted, caramel, or chocolate flavors. The brewer you're watching is mashing the malted grain is crushed and mixed with hot water at specific temperatures, typically 1:5158 that optimize enzyme activity. The enzymes break down remaining starches into fermentable sugars, creating a sweet liquid called wort. The wort is separated from the spent grain, then boiled with hops, flowers of the hop plant that provide bitterness to balance the malt sweetness, preserve the beer, and contribute aroma and flavor. Different hop varieties have dramatically different characteristics, from intensely bitter to fruity or floral. After boiling, the wort is cooled and transferred to fermentation vessels where yeast is added. The yeast consumes the sugars, producing alcohol and carbon dioxide as byproducts, but also producing hundreds of flavor compounds that give beer its complexity. Different yeast strains produce different flavor profiles. Ale yeasts ferment at warmer temperatures 60-75 F and produce fruity, complex flavors, while lager yeasts ferment cooler 45-55 F and produce cleaner, crisper beers. The fermentation takes 1 to 2 weeks for most beers. Then the beer is conditioned, which allows flavors to mature and harsh compounds to mellow. Autumn was traditionally an important brewing time because temperature control is crucial to brewing. Fermentation that occurs too warm produces off flavors, and before refrigeration, brewers had to work with seasonal temperatures. Spring and autumn provided the moderate temperatures ideal for brewing. While summer was too warm, fermentation would be too vigorous and produce unpleasant flavors, and winter too cold for proper fermentation. The strongest beers were often brewed in late autumn and stored through winter, aging and maturing, ready for consumption the following year. The history of brewing stretches back at least 7,000 years. Sumerian texts mention beer, and archaeological evidence suggests brewing may be even older. Beer production was often women's work in ancient and medieval societies. The words brewster and alewife are female-gendered occupations. In medieval Europe, brewing was often done by religious orders, and many of Europe's famous beer traditions originated in monasteries where monks brewed both for their own consumption. Beer was safer than water and provided nutrition, and for sale to support the monastery. The regulation of brewing and ale quality was serious business. Ale tasters were official positions in many towns, responsible for inspecting brewing operations and ensuring quality and fair pricing. The importance of beer in traditional societies is difficult for modern people to appreciate. It was a primary source of calories and nutrition. Beer contains B vitamins, minerals, and protein from the yeast. It was safer than water. The boiling step and alcohol content killed pathogens, and it was central to social and ceremonial life. The brewing occurring in the village brewhouse represents a tradition that has sustained and connected human societies since the earliest days of agriculture, turning grain into a beverage that's simultaneously nutritious, intoxicating, and celebratory. As darkness settles, we find ourselves at the village forge where the blacksmith is working late, creating the iron components that will be needed through winter. Hinges, latches, hooks, and tools. The forge fire glows bright red in the darkness, and the rhythmic hammering echoes through the quiet evening. Blacksmithing is one of the essential crafts of agricultural civilization, and watching a skilled smith work reveals the deep knowledge required to shape metal. Iron straight from the ore is too brittle to be useful. It contains too much carbon and impurities. The first step in iron working is refining ore into workable iron through smelting, which produces wrought iron low carbon or cast iron high carbon. Wrought iron is what the blacksmith typically works with. It can be heated to red or yellow heat and shaped by hammering without shattering. The blacksmith's fundamental technique is heating metal until it's plastic soft enough to shape but not molten, then shaping it through hammering, cutting, bending, or other operations, then allowing it to cool and harden. But there's enormous complexity within this basic process. Different operations require different temperatures, which the smith judges by color: black heat around 900F for gentle bending, red heat 1201, 300F for most forging operations, yellow heat 902, 00F for welding two pieces together, and white heat 200F or higher, approaching the metal's melting point, used only for special operations. The smith must also understand how metal behaves. Hammering not only shapes metal but also compresses and strengthens it through work hardening. The smith must know when to stop hammering and reheat the piece, because working cold metal can cause it to crack. For tools like chisels, axes, or knives that need to be hard enough to hold an edge but not so brittle that they shatter, the smith uses heat treatment, heating the shaped tool to red heat and then quenching it rapidly in water or oil, which creates a very hard but brittle structure, then tempering it by carefully reheating to a lower temperature judged by the color of oxide films that form on the clean steel straw: yellow for knives and chisels, blue for springs and axes, and cooling again, which slightly softens the metal and makes it tougher. Different metals require different techniques. Steel iron with controlled carbon content can be hardened through quenching, while pure wrought iron cannot. Copper and bronze require different temperatures and techniques than iron, and precious metals like silver and gold require still different approaches. The blacksmith must also master joinery, connecting pieces of metal through welding, heating two pieces to yellow heat and hammering them together so they fuse, riveting, or mechanical connections like hinges. The tools of the blacksmith's trade are themselves often blacksmith-made hammers of different sizes and shapes for different operations, tongs to hold hot work, Hardy's cutting tools that fit in the anvil, punches, drifts, and swages for specific shaping operations. The anvil itself is a precision tool, the flat face for general work, the horn for bending curves, the Pritchel hole for punching, and the Hardy hole for holding cutting tools. The work is physically demanding, requiring strength, endurance, and the ability to work in intense heat and noise, but it's also intensely skilled. A master blacksmith can create anything from a delicate hinge to a massive anchor, can repair broken tools and farm equipment, and can create new tools designed for specific purposes. Before the Industrial Revolution made mass-produced metal goods cheap and available, the village blacksmith was essential to community survival. Every farm tool, every piece of hardware, every horseshoe came from the forge. The smith you're watching, shaping glowing iron with hammer and anvil, is maintaining a tradition that stretches back to the Bronze Age, when humans first learned to work metal, creating the tools and hardware that make agricultural civilization possible. As we walk back toward the village center, we pass beneath an enormous oak tree and hear an unusual sound: a steady rain of acorns falling through the branches, though there's no wind. Looking more carefully, we can see the culprits. Gray squirrels are cutting acorns from the branches, allowing them to fall to the ground, where they'll later collect them for catching. This behavior reveals sophisticated decision-making and memory that's only recently been fully appreciated by scientists. Squirrels face a survival challenge. They need to accumulate enough food to survive winter, but they can't carry or store it all in one location, and they can't guard it continuously. Their solution is scatter hoarding, catching individual acorns or small groups of acorns in hundreds or even thousands of separate locations across their territory. This distributes risk. A cache discovered by another animal represents only a small loss, but it creates a seemingly impossible memory challenge. How does the squirrel find hundreds or thousands of buried acorns months later, often under snow? Early researchers assumed squirrels found cached acorns primarily by smell, randomly searching likely areas. But recent research using GPS trackers, memory tests, and detailed observation has revealed that squirrels have remarkable spatial memory and use sophisticated organizational strategies. They remember not just a general area where they cached food but the specific locations, and they can relocate caches with high accuracy months after burial. Even more surprisingly, squirrels organize their caches. They sort acorns by type, burying acorns from the same tree species together in different areas, essentially creating a filing system that makes retrieval more efficient. They also assess acorn quality before catching, and they handle acorns infested with weevils differently than clean acorns, sometimes eating infested ones immediately rather than storing them for later when the weevil larvae will have consumed the acorn's interior. Squirrels also engage in deceptive catching if they're being watched by other squirrels. They'll sometimes dig a cache hole, pretend to bury an acorn, cover the empty hole, then move to a different location and actually cache the acorn. This suggests they have theory of mind, the ability to understand that other individuals have mental states and might steal cached food. And so our ninth walk through this enduring autumn village draws to a close, the darkness now complete except for the glowing windows of cottages and the occasional lantern, the work of harvest long finished but the work of preparation and provision continuing, and the ancient patterns of agricultural life persisting. Human labor intertwined with animal behavior and plant cycles, technology and tradition merged in practices refined over millennia, connecting us to our agricultural past while the landscape around us prepares for winter's arrival. As dawn breaks on what feels like one of the last true autumn mornings before winter's grip tightens, we find ourselves walking through an orchard where the ground is covered with a thick layer of leaves that rustle and crackle underfoot. This leaf litter is far more than simple debris. It's the foundation of forest soil fertility and home to an entire hidden ecosystem. When leaves fall and begin to decompose, they enter what ecologists call the detrital food web, a complex system of organisms that breaks down dead organic matter and recycles nutrients back into forms that living plants can use. The process begins almost immediately after leaves hit the ground. Bacteria and fungi colonize the leaves, secreting enzymes that break down complex molecules like cellulose, lignin, and proteins into simpler compounds. These microorganisms are consumed by tiny invertebrate springtails, mites, and other creatures so small they're nearly invisible, which shred the leaves into smaller particles while digesting the microorganisms. Larger invertebrates like millipedes, bugs, and earthworms continue the process, consuming partially decomposed leaf material and grinding it further. Earthworms are particularly important in temperate forest ecosystems. A single acre might contain 1 million earthworms or more, and they can process several tons of leaf litter per year, pulling it underground and mixing it with mineral soil. This creates the rich, dark topsoil characteristic of healthy forests and gardens. The rate of decomposition varies dramatically depending on leaf chemistry. Oak leaves contain high levels of tannins and lignin and may take several years to fully decompose, while maple or ash leaves decompose much faster, often within a single year. This is why oak forests tend to have thick leaf litter layers while maple forests have thinner litter. The nutrients released by decomposition, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and many others, are immediately taken up by plant roots, fungi, and bacteria, entering living systems again. Without this decomposition process, nutrients would be locked up in dead matter, and plant growth would cease within years as soils became depleted. The leaf litter also provides crucial habitat. Salamanders, snakes, and small mammals shelter under it, Countless insects overwinter in it, and seeds germinate protected within it. The temperature under leaf litter stays more stable than exposed soil, warmer in winter, cooler in summer, creating favorable microclimates. Moisture is retained better under leaf litter, and the physical layer protects soil from erosion by rain and wind. Modern landscaping practices often remove fallen leaves entirely, sending them to landfills or municipal composting facilities, and this represents a massive nutrient export from the ecosystem. Gardens and lawns that have leaves removed year after year become increasingly dependent on fertilizer to replace the nutrients that would naturally be recycled through decomposition. The thick layer of leaves you're walking through represents the forest's nutrient bank account, wealth being deposited now that will be withdrawn gradually over coming months and years, sustaining the trees that produce the leaves and countless other organisms in an elegant cycle that has operated since plants first colonized land hundreds of millions of years ago. Walking on through the crisp morning air, we come to a field where a flock of juncos has appeared, small gray and white birds that weren't here yesterday or last week. These are dark-eyed juncos, and their arrival is one of the most reliable signs that winter is approaching. Juncos breed in northern boreal forests and mountains, and they migrate south to spend winter in more temperate regions, timing their movement with remarkable precision to arrive just as autumn transitions to winter. The birds you're seeing may have traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles from their breeding grounds in Canada or the northern United States, navigating by the sun, stars, and Earth's magnetic field to arrive at this exact location where they or their ancestors have wintered before. Bird migration timing is controlled by circannual rhythms, internal biological clocks that operate on roughly year-long cycles, synchronized by day length changes. As days shorten in autumn, juncos experience hormonal changes that trigger migratory restlessness and fat deposition, and they begin moving south, but they don't migrate all at once. The movement occurs in waves over weeks, with different age and sex classes moving at different times. Adult males tend to winter farthest north, young females farthest south, and adult females and young males in between. This differential migration creates interesting patterns. The juncos in a northern location in winter are predominantly adult males, while those in southern locations are predominantly young females. The reasons for this pattern are debated, but the dominant hypothesis is the body size hypothesis. Larger birds, adult males, can tolerate colder temperatures more easily because they have a lower surface area to volume ratio and lose heat more slowly. The behavior of wintering juncos reveals sophisticated social structure and foraging strategy. They form loose flocks that forage on the ground for seeds, and these flocks have dominance hierarchies maintained through displays and occasional aggressive interactions. Dominant birds feed in better microhabitats and spend less time vigilant for predators because they can rely on subordinate birds to watch for threats. The flocks often contain multiple species: chickadees, sparrows, and other small seed-eating birds, creating mixed species foraging groups that benefit from many eyes watching for predators. Juncos have regional dialects in their songs. Birds from different areas sing structurally similar songs but with subtle variations in frequency and timing, and researchers can identify where a junco is from by analyzing its song. This suggests that song is at least partially learned rather than purely genetic, and that juncos have cultural transmission of vocal patterns. The juncos you're seeing represent one of the great phenomena of the natural world: billions of birds moving across continents in response to seasonal change, finding their way across thousands of miles to specific wintering areas, surviving the journey through skill, adaptation, and no small amount of luck, then reversing the journey in spring to return to breeding grounds and continue the cycle. Their presence here marks the season as surely as the calendar, announcing that autumn is ending and winter's cold is imminent. The morning walk takes us past a small pond where ice has formed at the edges overnight, thin sheets that shatter when you touch them but mark the beginning of winter's freeze. The formation of ice on ponds and lakes follows predictable patterns governed by the unique properties of water, and understanding this process reveals why aquatic life can survive winter in frozen ponds. Under the ice, the pond will stratify in reverse of summer stratification. The coldest water just above freezing will be at the top under the ice, and the densest water 39°F will be at the bottom. Aquatic organisms adapt to this in various ways. Fish become less active as their metabolism slows in cold water, and some species enter a state of torpor, barely moving and barely eating. Turtles burrow into bottom mud and essentially hibernate, absorbing oxygen through specialized tissues in their throat and cloaca. Frogs either hibernate underwater absorbing oxygen through their skin or, for some species, hibernate on land in locations where they actually freeze solid. Their cells fill with glucose that acts as antifreeze, preventing ice crystal formation that would rupture cell membranes, and they survive in suspended animation until spring thaw revives them. Aquatic insects have various strategies. Some overwinter as eggs or larvae in the pond. Others emerge as adults in autumn and lay eggs that will hatch in spring. The ice forming at the pond's edge represents a threshold being crossed, the transition from autumn to winter, from the season of harvest and preparation to the season of endurance and survival. We continue our walk. We notice smoke rising from multiple chimneys in the village, and the smell of wood smoke fills the air, a smell that's both comforting and slightly acrid. This is the smell of autumn and winter in traditional communities, and it carries within it both chemistry and cultural memory. Wood smoke is a complex mixture of hundreds of different compounds produced when wood undergoes combustion. But for most of human history, wood smoke was an unavoidable part of life. Homes were heated by open fires or simple fireplaces that sent most of their heat up the chimney along with enormous volumes of smoke. The interiors of traditional cottages were often darkened by smoke deposits, and respiratory ailments were common. The cultural associations of wood smoke are powerful and contradictory for many people. The smell evokes comfort, home, autumn and winter celebrations, and connection to tradition. For others, it evokes discomfort, pollution, and health concerns. This tension between tradition and modern understanding of health impacts is characteristic of many aspects of traditional life. Practices that sustained our ancestors and carry deep cultural meaning must be reevaluated in light of current knowledge, and the balance between preservation of tradition and adoption of healthier practices is often contentious. The wood smoke drifting across the village represents continuity with the past. Humans have burned wood for warmth for hundreds of thousands of years, making it one of our oldest and most fundamental technologies, but also raises questions about sustainability and health that our ancestors didn't face or couldn't address. The afternoon brings us to a small family cemetery on a hillside overlooking the village, where we find someone planting bulbs, daffodils, and crocuses that will bloom in spring. This practice of planting spring bulbs in autumn, particularly in cemeteries and memorial gardens, connects the cycle of seasons with the cycle of life and death in ways that provide both practical beauty and philosophical comfort. Spring bulbs like daffodils, tulips, and crocuses require a period of cold dormancy before they can bloom. This is called vernalization, and it ensures that the bulbs don't sprout during autumn or winter only to be killed by frost. The bulbs must experience temperatures below 45°F for several weeks, which triggers biochemical changes that prepare them for spring growth. Planting bulbs in autumn gives them time to develop roots before the ground freezes, establishing themselves so they're ready to grow rapidly when spring warmth arrives. The first warm days of late winter or early spring trigger sprouting, and the plants grow, bloom, and complete their reproductive cycle quickly, taking advantage of the brief window before trees leaf out and shade the ground. After flowering, the foliage remains green for several weeks, photosynthesizing and storing energy in the bulb for next year's bloom. Then the foliage dies back and the bulb enters summer dormancy underground. This growth pattern, called spring ephemeral, allows bulbs to thrive in environments that would be unsuitable for most plants, exploiting the early spring window when light is abundant but competition is minimal. The tradition of planting bulbs in cemeteries has multiple meanings. On a practical level, spring bulbs are low maintenance and naturalize readily, spreading and multiplying over years with little care required. They provide bright color and beauty in early spring when few other plants are blooming. On a symbolic level, their emergence from cold, dark soil into brilliant bloom represents resurrection, renewal, and the continuity of life, themes that resonate in contexts of death and remembrance. Different flowers carry different symbolic meanings. Daffodils represent rebirth and new beginnings. Crocuses represent cheerfulness and youth. And tulips represent perfect love. The Victorian language of flowers assigned specific meanings to hundreds of different plants, and these associations influenced what was planted in memorial gardens. The person planting bulbs is performing an act that bridges present and future. The bulbs planted today won't bloom for months, and then caretaker may or may not be present to see them. But the act of planting expresses faith in the future, continuity across seasons, and the endurance of memory and beauty despite loss. It's a quiet affirmation that life continues, that spring will come again, that growth and beauty persist through cycles of death and dormancy. The bulbs being tucked into the soil beside weathered headstones represent hope, memory, and the deep human need to mark our passing and the passing of those we love with something beautiful and enduring. As the afternoon light begins to fade, we make our way to the highest point in the village where an old watchtower stands, used in earlier times to watch for fires or approaching danger. From this vantage point, we can see the entire valley spread below us, the patchwork of harvested fields, the dark lines of hedgerows and stone walls, the village clustered around its central square, the winding silver thread of the stream, and in the distance, the dark mass of forest. This aerial perspective reveals the landscape as a palimpsest, a document that has been written on, erased, and written on again countless times, each generation leaving its mark. The field patterns reflect decisions made decades or centuries ago about how to divide land and rotate crops. The hedgerows and walls mark property boundaries established by long-dead landowners, and they follow the contours of the land in ways that demonstrate deep understanding of drainage, soil types, and microclimates. The village location itself was chosen for specific reasons: proximity to water, defensible position, good drainage, and fertile surrounding land, and the layout of streets and buildings reflects organic growth over generations. The stream's course has probably shifted slightly over centuries as floods eroded banks and deposited sediment, but its general path through the valley is as old as the landscape itself. This perspective connects you to everyone who has stood in this spot before and looked out at this valley, seeing it in different seasons, in different states of cultivation, with different buildings and different field patterns, but fundamentally the same place, shaped by the same forces of geology, climate, ecology, and human labor. The view from the watchtower is a view across time as much as across space, connecting past and present in the enduring landscape. As twilight deepens, we descend from the watchtower and make our way toward the village church, where bells are beginning to ring for evensong. We've encountered these bells before on our walks, but tonight we pause to really listen as the changes ring out, a complex pattern of notes that seems mathematical and musical simultaneously. The ropes can cause serious injury if handled incorrectly, and ringers occasionally sustain rope burns or injuries from being pulled into the air by a bell that's swinging too vigorously. The bells themselves are substantial investments. A ring of 8 bells might weigh several tons collectively, require a specially reinforced tower to house them, and cost as much as a house. The sound of change ringing carries for miles, and in the past, it served as communication. Specific patterns indicated different events or situations, and villagers would recognize what the bells were announcing even at a distance. The ringing you're hearing tonight is calling people to prayer, marking the day's end, and continuing a tradition that connects this autumn evening to centuries of autumn evenings before, when these same bells rang out across this same valley, calling communities together, marking time, and creating acoustic monuments to human coordination and mathematical beauty. As full darkness settles, we join the small congregation gathering in the church for the harvest Thanksgiving service, a tradition that marks the formal end of the harvest season and expresses gratitude for the year's abundance. The church is decorated with produce, sheaves of wheat, baskets of apples and root vegetables, gourds and pumpkins, and loaves of bread baked from the new wheat. The theology expressed in these services represents a particular worldview about humanity's relationship with nature and God, one that sees abundance as gift rather than earned reward, that acknowledges human dependence on weather, soil, and forces beyond our control, and that emphasizes responsibility to share abundance with those in need. This worldview is increasingly distant from modern industrial society's perspective, which tends to view food production as a technical economic process where inputs, seed, fertilizer, machinery, labor generate outputs, crops in a fairly predictable, controllable way. The vulnerability that agricultural peoples felt knowing that drought, flood, hail, frost, disease, or pests could destroy a year's work and threaten survival is largely invisible to people who buy food in supermarkets and rarely consider where it comes from or how precarious its production can be. Yet climate change is making this vulnerability visible again as extreme weather events disrupt production and supply chains, reminding us that food security is never guaranteed and always depends on natural systems we don't fully control. The Harvest Thanksgiving service, with its decorations of produce and its themes of gratitude and sharing, represents a practice worth preserving not for religious reasons alone but as a cultural reminder of our dependence on the land, the seasons, and the complex systems that convert sunlight, soil, and water into food that sustains human life. As the service concludes and people emerge into the cold night air, we notice that the first stars are appearing in a sky that's perfectly clear, and we also notice our breath condensing into visible clouds with each exhalation. This breath condensation is a simple phenomenon that marks cold weather's arrival. The air you exhale is warm, approximately 98.6 F, and saturated with water vapor from your lungs and airways. When this warm, moist breath hits cold air, it cools rapidly, and cool air can't hold as much moisture as warm air, so the excess water vapor condenses into tiny droplets, creating a visible cloud. The same principle governs fog formation, cloud formation, and the condensation trails left by high-altitude aircraft. The temperature at which this condensation occurs, the dew point, varies with humidity. On a very dry night, you might not see your breath until temperatures drop well below freezing, while on a humid night, breath might be visible at temperatures in the 40s. Seeing your breath is one of those simple phenomena that connects you directly to physical principles and to your own physiology. You're literally seeing the water vapor that your body produces as a byproduct of respiration. Approximately a liter per day under normal conditions, more during heavy work or exercise. This water must be expelled because your lungs need to remain at a precise moisture level to function properly. Too dry and the delicate lung tissues become damaged and gas exchange becomes inefficient. Too wet and you'd essentially drown in your own fluid. The exquisite balance your body maintains, extracting oxygen from air, expelling carbon dioxide and water vapor, all while regulating temperature, pH, and countless other variables, is an engineering marvel that happens unconsciously, billions of times over a lifetime, pausing only at death. The condensation of breath on a cold autumn evening represents the intersection of inner and outer environments, the interface between the controlled conditions of your living body and the changing conditions of the external world. a visible reminder of the constant exchange between organism and environment that characterizes all life. As we walk slowly back toward the village square for the final time, we find ourselves reflecting on everything we've witnessed over these 10 walks through autumn. We've seen the transformation of leaves from green to brilliant colors and their eventual fall, and we've learned the chemistry and biology behind these changes. We've watched wildlife preparing for winter, from squirrels catching acorns to birds migrating south to bees clustering in their hives. We've witnessed the harvest in all its forms: grain, fruit, vegetables, nuts, and the many preservation techniques that transform perishable abundance into storable sustenance. We've observed traditional crafts and technologies: milling, smithing, brewing, tanning, coopering, weaving, each representing accumulated knowledge refined over generations. We've learned about the hidden complexity in phenomena we usually take for granted: soil formation from leaf litter, water turning over in ponds, frost forming on grass. We've discovered the intelligence and sophistication of organisms often dismissed as simple: the navigational abilities of migrating birds, the memory and planning capacity of squirrels, the social organization of crows, and we've connected with human traditions that mark the season's: harvest festivals, storytelling around fires, Thanksgiving services, practices that acknowledge our dependence on natural cycles and celebrate the successful completion of another agricultural year. These autumn village strolls have been a journey through both space and time, walking the physical landscape while also walking through the layers of history, tradition, knowledge, and meaning embedded in that landscape. Every field, tree, building, and path has a story. Every seasonal change triggers cascading responses through the ecosystem. Every traditional practice embodies hard-won knowledge about how to live sustainably in a particular place. The village we've been walking through is in many ways a reconstruction. Few places in the modern world still function according to these traditional patterns. Mechanization, globalization, and urbanization have transformed agriculture and rural life almost beyond recognition. The knowledge we've been discussing: how to judge when grain is ready for harvest, how to build a stable stone wall, how to interpret weather signs, how to forage safely for wild foods, is possessed by fewer and fewer people with each passing generation. There's legitimate debate about whether this represents progress or loss, efficiency or disconnection, liberation or impoverishment. But standing here in the village square on this clear, cold autumn evening, with frost forming and stars emerging and the last light fading from the western sky, it's possible to feel connected across time to all the people who have stood in similar places on similar evenings, looking at similar skies, feeling similar cold, and experiencing similar emotions: gratitude for survival through another year, satisfaction at work completed, apprehension about winter ahead, and hope that spring will come again, bringing warmth and renewal. These experiences are fundamentally human, shared across cultures and centuries, connecting us to our ancestors and to agricultural peoples everywhere who live by the rhythm of the seasons. The cycle of the year continues. Autumn is ending. Winter is beginning, but spring will follow, then summer, then autumn again, in the endless wheel of seasons. The knowledge and traditions we've explored on these walks represent humanity's long experience of living within these cycles rather than trying to escape them, of observing natural patterns and aligning human activities with them, of celebrating abundance and preparing for scarcity, of remembering the past while providing for the future. Whether we live in villages or cities, whether we grow our own food or buy it in stores, whether we heat with wood or electricity, we remain embedded in these same natural cycles, dependent on the same ecological systems, subject to the same seasonal changes. The more we understand about how these systems work, the complexity of soil ecology, the sophistication of animal behavior, the accumulated wisdom in traditional practices, the more we can appreciate both the natural world and the human ingenuity that has allowed our species to thrive across diverse environments and climates. And so our autumn village strolls come to an end, the harvest complete, the preparations for winter well advanced, the ancient patterns continuing as they have for countless generations. The landscape settles into its winter sleep, the village grows quiet in the cold darkness, and we take our leave knowing that this cycle of growth and harvest, abundance and scarcity, activity and rest will turn again, as it always has, as it always will, connecting past and future in the eternal present of the changing seasons. The 100 facts have been woven into 10 walks. The story of autumn has been told, and now, as the first snow begins to fall in soft, silent flakes, we conclude our journey through this timeless landscape where human tradition and natural cycle intertwine, where knowledge and observation merge, where the past informs the present, and where the ancient rhythms of agricultural life continue their eternal dance with the turning year.